Hey, do you have a minute? Let's talk about the climate. Welcome to Klima Minute, where we give you beat-by-beat updates of what's up and what's happening here in Glasgow, Scotland for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Klima Minute is brought to you by Living Laudato Si, Aksyon Klima, and AEG. My name is Val Vestil, and I'm your host. Everyone has goals, right? Relationship goals, squad goals, family goals, career goals, even personal goals. And it's no different here in COP26. When you organize a conference as big as this, with global leaders coming under one roof, you have to have goals, right? Well, they have identified 4 specific goals here at COP26 that they hope to achieve by the end of the forum. Let's talk about them one by one. And one of them is actually right behind me. The first goal is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. This is actually the bulk of what's happening at the negotiation tables, where countries are being asked to come forward with very ambitious emission reduction targets. And how can countries do this? Number 1, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal. Say no to coal. Number 2, countries need to curtail deforestation. Number 3, countries need to speed up the switch to electric vehicles. And number 4, countries need to encourage investment in renewables. The second goal is adaptation. Countries need to work together to protect and restore ecosystems, as well as build defenses and resilient infrastructure to prevent the loss of livelihood. Number 3, mobilize finance. Developed and rich countries need to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance for countries that need it the most, especially the Philippines. The final goal, and probably my favorite, is work together to deliver. This means we need to finalize the Paris Rulebook and collaborate as governments, business, and civil society organizations to tackle the climate action. Hey, do you have a minute? Let's talk about the climate. Welcome to Klima Minute. Hey, do you have a minute? Let's talk about the climate. Welcome to Klima Minute, where we give you beat-by-beat updates of what's up and what's happening here in Glasgow, Scotland for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Klima Minute is brought to you by Living Laudato Si, Aksyon Klima, and AEG. My name is Val Vestil, and I'm your host. Everyone has goals, right? Relationship goals, squad goals, family goals, career goals, even personal goals. And it's no different here in COP26. When you organize a conference as big as this, with global leaders coming under one roof, you have to have goals, right? Well, they have identified 4 specific goals here at COP26 that they hope to achieve by the end of the forum. Let's talk about them one by one. And one of them is actually right behind me. The first goal is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. This is actually the bulk of what's happening at the negotiation tables, where countries are being asked to come forward with very ambitious emission reduction targets. And how can countries do this? Number one, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal. Say no to coal. Number two, countries need to curtail deforestation. Number three, countries need to speed up the switch to electric vehicles. And number four, countries need to encourage investment in renewables. The second goal is adaptation. Countries need to work together to protect and restore ecosystems, as well as build defenses and resilient infrastructure to prevent the loss of livelihood. Number three, mobilize finance. Developed and rich countries need to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance for countries that need it the most, especially the Philippines. The final goal, and probably my favorite, is work together to deliver. This means we need to finalize the Paris Rulebook and collaborate as governments, business, and civil society organizations to tackle the climate action. Hey, do you have a minute? Let's talk about the climate. Welcome to Klima Minute, where we give you beat-by-beat updates of what's up and what's happening here in Glasgow, Scotland for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Klima Minute is brought to you by Living Laudato Si, Aksyon Klima, and AEG. My name is Val Vestille, and I'm your host. Everyone has goals, right? Relationship goals, squad goals, family goals, career goals, even personal goals. And it's no different here in COP26. When you organize a conference as big as this, with global leaders coming under one roof, you have to have goals, right? Well, they have identified 4 specific goals here at COP26 that they hope to achieve by the end of the forum. Let's talk about them one by one. And one of them is actually right behind me. The first goal is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. This is actually the bulk of what's happening at the negotiation tables, where countries are being asked to come forward with very ambitious emission reduction targets. And how can countries do this? Number one, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal. Say no to coal. Number two, countries need to curtail deforestation. Number three, countries need to speed up the switch to electric vehicles. And number four, countries need to encourage investment in renewables. The second goal is adaptation. Countries need to work together to protect and restore ecosystems, as well as build defenses and resilient infrastructure to prevent the loss of life.
Isang mapagpalaya at makakalikasang umaga po sa inyong lahat at malugod ko po kayong wini-welcome sa ating forum na pinamagatang Turning Ambition into Reality, Climate Action in the Philippines after COP26 and Beyond. Ako po si Jermaine Halandoni de Runya, ang inyong magiging tagapagpadaloy ngayong umagang ito. This public forum aims to accomplish po the following. Una, is to present the main outcomes of the UNFCCC COP26 that are most relevant to the Philippine context. Ikalawa, to explain how the developments at COP26 could enhance climate change adaptation and mitigation in the Philippines in aid of the pursuit of sustainable development and climate justice. At ikatlo po, is to discuss the ways forward for meaningful civil society participation in the Philippine climate action after COP26. And this event is organized by Aksyon Klima Pilipinas in partnership with Living Laudato Si Philippines, Greenpeace Philippines, the Ecology Ministry of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Manila, and the Association of Young Environmental Journalists in observance of the 2021 National Climate Change Consciousness Week. And also, we are live po on the following FB pages: Aksyon Klima, Living Laudato Si, Archdiocese of Manila, Greenpeace Philippines, Okonomedia, LCOY at Youth for Strike, and Youth for Strike Climate. And please po, feel free to share this forum and don't forget po to use the following hashtags: hashtag Climate Justice Now at hashtag COP26. But before we start this forum po, magkaroon po muna tayo ng isang maiksing panalangin na susundan ng ating pambansang awit.
A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace.
Alright, to formally open po this forum, pakinggan natin ang ating opening remarks mula sa isang experienced international lawyer and policy analyst with a demonstrated history of working in international trade, climate change, environment, investment, human rights, and sustainable development policy in NGOs, academe, and intergovernmental organizations in multicultural setting. Ang ating pong lead negotiator sa G77 plus China, Attorney Vicente Paulo Yu.
Magandang umaga at welcome to this panel event. Ako po si Vice Yu. I was the International Policy Advisor of the Chair of the Group of 77 in China at COP26 in Glasgow that just recently concluded. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this panel event. We have a good lineup of speakers today, many of whom were at the COP26, and they will be able to provide us with their impressions and their views of the failures and of the successes that were achieved at Glasgow. I think what is more important also for us to keep in mind as we go through the panel event and listening to the speakers is to think through and identify what is it that we as individuals, as organizations, as a community, and as a country can do to help increase and raise the voice of climate justice, raise the voice of equity in terms of how we as an international community and as a national community deal with climate change and its impacts on our people. And I think one of those things that we will need to focus on at the end of the panel event is to then reflect on how to move forward so that the voice of the Philippines, the voice of our communities, indigenous communities, urban poor, rural communities, our youth, our educators, and our leaders are one in terms of highlighting the perspective of the Philippines as a climate justice champion and the perspective of developing countries in seeking a fairer and better world for all of us in the future. Thank you very much and enjoy the panel event.
Salamat po, Attorney Yu. Tama po. We need to think through what we can do as a community to raise our voice towards climate justice and how do we move forward after COP26, especially to move forward and to raise the voice of those in the periphery, yung ating pong mga magsasaka, mangingisda, katutubong Pilipino at nasa laylayan. Ngayon naman po, to give us fast facts and figures about COP26, we have with us the head of the Climate Change and Energy Program of the Worldwide Fund for Nature Philippines, and concurrently serves as the Earth Hour Philippines National Director. We have with us Attorney Angela Gia Ibay.
Good morning to
Good
everyone.
morning po.
Yes, so thank you again to Action Klima for inviting WWF to be part of this panel discussion. And I'm just asked here to give you some facts and figures about what happened in COP26. We know it follows the backdrop of two things that I find critical. One is that there was the issuance of the second and the working group one's report, part of the IPCC assessment report, the physical science basis, and we're very glad that we have one of the three Filipina leading authors of that report will be discussing, so I won't go into the details. But second, of course, it's also in the backdrop also of everyone, all of the countries still fighting against the pandemic, against what's happening in terms of COVID-19. And it's because of this that the COP26, we all know, got postponed by a year. So it did happen this year, spilled over to the 13th, 14th na sa Philippines, because the gavel was actually brought down at around 11:27 in the evening of the 13th in Glasgow. As the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, it's also the meeting of the CMA, or the Conference of the Parties, parties to the Paris Agreement, meeting as parties to the Paris Agreement, and the CMP, the Conference of the Parties and parties to the Kyoto Protocol. It's also known as to be the first major environmental meeting that's not fully virtual. So it was held in person since the beginning of the pandemic, and one of the largest, actually, based on statistics from the UNFCCC. Over 40,000 participants, including party delegates, media representatives, and observers. And therefore, it was a big task of the UNFCCC to have, as well as the COP presidency, to have a code of conduct in terms of COVID-19 and for health protocols that all of these registered participants had to follow and undertake. COP26 is known to be, or there were endeavors really to make it as carbon neutral as possible. So there is a validation process that is currently being done to ensure that it follows this standard of carbon neutrality, and it's said to be the first one that will achieve this validation. And any carbon emissions that are unavoided will be offset by according to the presidency. And therefore also there was clear values that they've put in ensuring that the sustainability is embedded and woven throughout the activities of the conference. From the food that the delegates ate, were the sources of it, so that there's less impact, or they would mitigate the impact on the environment as well as the local community. Further, we know that the UNFCCC has been trying to do this, really going paperless, and they've maximized the use also of the UNFCCC platform, wherein many of us who had to also not physically be there but wanted to track what was happening were able to use the webcast portions of the UNFCCC app. But there were also activities that endeavored to make it as low carbon as possible, especially in terms of alternative uses of energy. So we know that there are four main goals that the presidency set out for itself. One is regarding ambition, and this is all the discussion about accelerating decarbonization, curtailing deforestation, ensuring more increased renewable energy investments, and also the push to e-mobility or e-vehicles. So this all so that we can all keep to the 1.5 degree threshold. Second is on adaptation and ensuring how do we protect and preserve and conserve our communities and natural habitats and ecosystems, and ensuring that if there will be infrastructure, that these are sustainable infrastructures in place. Third is the whole issue about finance. We know that there is $100 billion by 2020 promise that was not kept. So how do we mobilize that, and how to, in fact, if ever, be able to increase it? And then fourth is how do we work together? And this is the whole aspect of the Paris Rulebook, or the IRR of the Paris Agreement, that the missing points should definitely be finished so that we can all move forward and collaborate in implementing the Paris Agreement. Other highlights include there was a leader summit. 120 world leaders gave the clear signal that they want to keep 1.5 alive. The high-level segment where the Philippine head of delegation, Secretary Dominguez, spoke. There were 3 sessions. The second session, he was the last speaker, which was at 2:30 in the morning in the Philippines. And then, of course, the negotiations proper. You have the SBI sessions, SABSTA sessions, and the different plenaries. The presidency also sanctioned its own events, and throughout the 2 weeks, there were many side events, whether within the conference area itself, the different zones, as well as outside, all living through our different themes that were made in COP. So that includes finance, forestry, energy, water, oceans, gender, cities. So many themes for which there were many side events that happened. Another backdrop is that the UNFCCC Secretariat issued its NDC synthesis report, wherein there were 165 NDCs that they put together in the synthesis report. And one key takeaway there is that there would still be an increase of about 16% in global emissions by 2030, despite the fact that the new and updated NDCs will actually decrease emissions by 12%. But overall, if they will be looking at it, there will still be an increase. So that's a worrying thing, and that was something that delegates going into COP had to take into consideration, especially when we look at this, the ambition mechanism of the Paris Agreement. Further, we also know that the presence of the Philippine delegation, headed by Secretary Dominguez. Based on the final list of the UNFCCC, there were 20 delegates from the Philippines, 9 from DOF, 8 from DFA, 2 from DOE, 1 from DNR. As we mentioned, he spoke at the high-level segment. I'll not go through his speech. These are the highlights of what he spoke. And many of us have read and have heard his speech also. And I think many of these aspects will also be discussed by our panelists later on. Aside from that, there were also they also attended events such as the launching of the energy transition mechanism, for which the Philippines and Indonesia, and I hear even Vietnam now is being looked into as pilot countries. And then, of course, we're very fortunate that Vice, who opened this discussion, and Yusik Fentabella worked together on the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage for many of the texts that was included there. Other big announcements, which this one is a listing that I tried to come up with of what the Philippines had supported. There was the Declaration on Forest and Land Use, which is to end deforestation by 2030, the Global Methane Pledge, the Global Coal to Clean Power Transition Statement, which was partially endorsed by Secretary Cusi. Two other big announcements that have to do with the agricultural sector. And of course, we know that there was new support that was given to the Adaptation Fund, which hopefully I would believe the Philippines would be very interested in. Other announcements which the Philippines did not join, or I didn't see any statements to this effect, but I just wanted to flag these things, and especially two things that have to do with, one is on green shipping corridors. Second, that there will be establishment of zero-emission maritime routes. And since we're a coprologic country, this might be something that down the line we will have to look into. And then second is the launch of the International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, which will have an effect in terms of the aviation industries as they want to reduce their CO2 coming from that sector itself. Lastly, and will be the meat of many of what our panelists will actually discuss, so I'm just setting the stage. So the Glasgow Climate Pact has this outline. The text actually is divided into 3 documents. There's the cover decision. Then there are the decisions covering the convention as well as in the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. So many of our discussion today, this morning, will revolve in many aspects of this and its impact, of course, in the Philippines. Lastly, I would like to say that there are many firsts here. The specific mention of the recognition of reduction from coal and fossil fuel subsidies, the formal recognition of nature and ecosystems, and of course, there are many things yet. The specific mention of IPCC report as being front and center. So with that, thank you again, and I hope this gives us a background of what we will be discussing more for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Gia, for giving that very comprehensive update and fast facts about COP26. And ngayon naman po, to discuss to us about the foundations for a science-based approach to climate resilience in the Philippines, makakasama natin ang isang climate scientist and head of the Regional Climate Systems Laboratory at the Manila Observatory in the Philippines. Siya rin po ay ang lead author in the Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as a contributing author to the 2016 Philippine Climate Change Assessment, the Physical Science Basis, and the Philippine Climate Extremes Report 2020. Everyone, we have with us Dr. Faye Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. So I will just share my screen. I hope you can hear me well naman po.
Loud and clear po. Go ahead po, Doc.
Thank you very much. So again, good morning to all, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to give this presentation. And so this morning, I will just share some thoughts on how we can have science-based information to support climate action, and also cite some examples, as well as, based on the work that we have done at the Manila Observatory, and also give some examples of the tools and data available. So we are familiar with the IPCC risk framework, which presents that there are three elements that affect risk. So namely, this would be hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And if we wanted to have, what would be best is that we will have an integrated approach in addressing risk, wherein we both look at that there's this physical and social factors affecting risk. So since I'm coming from the physical hazards side, the physical factor side, this presentation has that bias though, so I hope that you could pardon that. But what I just wanted to say is that it's important to understand the hazard, since if we better understand it, then it can improve the risk assessment that we will have. And so we can also allows us to come up with the appropriate preparation and response to such hazards. Robust scientific knowledge of climate change and variability at global, regional, and national and local scales is also crucial in understanding disaster risk, which is actually one of the 4 priorities for action under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And this would be a good basis for effective disaster risk management, and to also inform potential investments. Following this risk framework, the AR6 report, as mentioned by Attorney Gia, in this report, we introduced a new concept of climatic impact drivers. And this would be to help translate the physical changes in climate. For example, heat and cold, wet and dry, winds, coastal and flooding and erosion, among others, into what they mean to society and ecosystems. And it's not just looking at the gradual changes in, for example, temperature and rainfall and sea levels, but also looking into whether they go over the thresholds, which are known to lead to severe consequences for people, agriculture, and for the different sectors. Unlike the previous assessment reports of the IPCC, the AR6 report is new in the sense that it reflects the recent advances in the regional climate science. And this allowed us to come up actually with one of the key findings of the report, wherein we find that climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways, and that the changes that we experience will increase with further warming. And so we find that we will see greater changes in climate at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degree global warming in most regions, and that it will become even more widespread and more pronounced at higher warming levels. For Southeast Asia, this is true, and we see that in the future increases in average temperature, extreme heat, heavy rainfall, flooding, and relative sea level. The increases in relative sea level which would have consequences for worsening coastal flooding and erosion, especially for low-lying coastal cities. This is a concern for the Philippines, as we know, since our country is a hotspot for climate risk. And it's because of our high exposure to multiple hazards, and also because of our vulnerability and limitations in coping capacities. Since 1990, the country has experienced at least 432 natural disaster events, about 80% of this due to storms and floods. And it's important that we understand our risk, our climate risk, given that we expect that these hazards will continue into the future, especially under a warming climate. And it's also important to note that we need to have high resolution climate information, or climate information at a resolution that will be able to capture the spatial variability in the hazards and impacts as shown here. So we could see from these maps that the different areas will be affected, for example, by typhoons in different ways and in different magnitudes. There are actually different sources of climate information. So we can get that from observations, model projections, from the literature, process understanding, and also from climate experts. And from these multiple lines of evidence, these are then synthesized with also information on the corresponding uncertainties. And this is actually discussed in depth in the AR6 report, particularly in chapter 10. So if you're interested in that. But what's important to also note is that it's not just having this regional climate change information, but it's also now we realize that it's very important that we engage with the end users so that it will be more usable and more actionable. We also adopted this in the AR6 report, where we try to move from, because for example, working group 1 is really focused on the physical science side of climate change, whereas working group 2 is looking into vulnerability impacts and adaptation. So in the AR6 report, we move from the handover to a handshake. So there's more engagement between the two working groups, but also including the working group 3, which is on mitigation. Here, I'd like to give an example of trying to adopt this approach in the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project, wherein the Manila Observatory, together with Ateneo de Manila University, National Resilience Council, City of Iloilo, and UPV, as well as the LGUs of Naga City and Metro Manila, work together in conducting their climate and disaster risk assessment. So in this example, I just show here the case for Iloilo City. So the CIDRA is a first step towards building truly resilient climate communities. And it's important that it helps us with understanding the root causes of risk while gaining insight into potential impacts at the local level. And so to help them make evidence-based decisions on appropriate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction strategies. So before I end, I'd like to just to summarize and share some thoughts on how we bridge the science to policy and practice towards building climate resilience. And so, as I mentioned, it's important to understand hazards, but we have to remember that there can be multiple hazards that would affect risk, as well as it's important to also look into the social factors affecting risk. In terms of having the future change, looking at the future changes in climate hazards, there are some things to consider, like for example, the projections, the methods and models used are actually being regularly updated. So it's important that we are also updated with that information. And then, as I mentioned, it's important to understand the needs and capabilities of users to ensure information is appropriate, useful, and understandable. And also the communication of the climate change projections to stakeholders for effective use in policy and decision making. There are several decision support tools that can support this. So for example, in AR6 introduced the interactive atlas, where you can, it allows you to look into the projected changes in climate in different regions. You can get climate information for over Southeast Asia from this site, the SARCSIS site. We also have produced this Philippine Climate Extremes Report 2020, which has information on future changes in extremes in the Philippines, both as maps and as tables. And we introduced the Climate Extremes Risk Analysis Matrix that can be used for planning as a complement to the Climate Information Risk Analysis Matrix that's already being used in the CIDRA process. So this is what it looks like, wherein we try to show how the information, the climate information can be used for can be used to assess the impacts, as well as look into the adaptation options. And then finally, I'd like to show another product of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project, which is the Resilience Toolkit. And it is actually a knowledge database designed to help disaster management planners, risk and or resilience practitioners and local government units to look into what are the available technologies and also case studies that they can use to enhance their city's climate and disaster risk resilience. So I invite you to look into these sites for more information. And so before I end, I'd like to also invite you all to our webinar launch for the Philippine Climate Extremes Report. I have just given a preview of that, but on Friday, November 26th to 2 p.m., you can join us at our event, and it's also part of the Climate Change Consciousness Week, to get some more information on the Extremes Report, the SERAM, and also the CliMap, wherein you can get information online. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Alright, maraming salamat po, Dr. Cruz, sa pagpapaliwanag nga po on why we need to have a science-based approach to achieve climate resilience in the Philippines. And now naman po, to zero in on the main outcomes at COP26 and the implications on the Philippine government's pursuit of sustainable development and climate resilience, we have with us the Chief of the Climate Change Service of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He is also a regular member of the Philippine Delegation to the sessions of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and as the country representative in the ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change. He is also the pioneering executive director of the National Solid Waste Management Commission and chaired the multi-sectoral drafting committee of the IRRs of the RA 9003. Everyone, we have Mr. Albert Magalang of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Hapon na. Anyway, karating ko lang po kasi kaya medyo namamalat pa. And maraming salamat sa organizers ng event na ito for giving us an opportunity to share with the public the outcomes of COP26 and also anong implications nitong outcomes sa different programs and projects ng government. So maraming salamat po at kahit pa paano may isang taga-government na na-invite dito sa event nito. So I'm sharing a few slides. And I would like to, paano ba to? Okay. As requested, I have here the Glasgow climate impact, and the contents of the pact has been already mentioned by Attorney Gia. Maraming salamat po, Attorney Gia. And to start with, diretso na tayo kasi due to a limited time, I would start with science and urgency as part of the outline ng Glasgow Climate Pact. So basically, ni-welcome yung report, IPCC 6 assessment report as prepared by the working group 1, and also looking at yung parties have taken into consideration yung recent global and regional reports on the state of the climate. Dati kasi hindi pinapansin yung IPCC. Ngayon, talagang pinakita at in-stress na kailangan na bigyan ito ng pansin. And then also, in 2022, the IPCC was requested by parties to submit reports. Parang may kasunod na report na isasubmit ang IPCC in 2022 during the session ng subsidiary body on science and technological advice. And then also, alarming yung sinasabi na there is already utmost concern on the 1.1 degrees centigrade global warming today, which are being felt in every region. Halos ng 5 UN regions are already experiencing these impacts, and also the urgency of enhancing mission and action in mitigation, adaptation, and finance in order to address the gaps. And on the adaptation, parties have expressed there's serious concern the findings of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Dahil nandun yung adverse impacts of climate and weather extremes, na sabi nila, according to the IPCC, this will continue to increase with every additional increment of rising temperatures. And also parties have recognized the scaling up of action and support to enhance adaptive capacity, especially yung kailangan ng mga developing country parties in order to strengthen the resilience and reduce vulnerability. And also the importance of national adaptation plans to enhance understanding and implementation of adaptation actions and priorities. In fact, parties have also, developing country parties have also requested for further support para magawa yung kanilang mga national adaptation plans. So there's also the necessity to integrate adaptation into local, national, and regional planning, which I think the Philippines has already worked on this. And then also to the IPCC has also been requested to present at COP27 the findings from the working group 1 to the IPCC assessment report, 6th assessment report. And this assessment report should include adaptation needs and researches as well on impacts, response options, and adaptation needs. On the finance, as regards to adaptation, my concern yung mga parties that the current provision of climate finance for adaptation would remain so insufficient to respond to worsening climate change impacts, especially yung mga na-raise ng mga developing country parties. Kulang na kulang. In fact, may problema tayo kung saan manggagaling adaptation fund this year and sa mga susunod na araw ng mga taon. So developed countries have been urged to scale up urgent support for adaptation to develop, especially yung sinasabi natin na isama na rin yung formulation and implementation of national adaptation plans dahil kailangan tayong support on this sa paggawa mismo ng adaptation plans, mas lalo na sa implementation. So kailangan na-identify din ng mga country parties that there should be adequacy and predictability of adaptation finance, including the value of adaptation fund in delivering dedicated support for adaptation. So my dedicated fund for adaptation, and some of these funds could be sourced from recent pledges by developed countries to increase their provision, especially madagdagan yung climate finance to support adaptation, and also ang sinasabi ng least developing countries, developing countries na dapat madagdagan yung LDC fund. And also to identify multilateral development banks, other financial institutions, and private sector to deliver resources to achieve climate adaptation plans. And also explore na rin yung mga innovative approaches and instruments for mobilizing finance. So talagang kailangan pa rin intindihin natin kung ano talaga ang itsura ng adaptation funds na ito, sources pati, and we have to work on the specifics kasi generalized masyado ang mga statements as regards to finance, hindi lang adaptation. And then mitigation. So again, parties have reaffirmed yung recognition ng long-term global goal of the Paris Agreement. That is, in fact, if we have to, based on the report ng IPCC, parties have already recognized the impacts of climate change, especially at yung sa if we have the condition wherein mas madadagdagan at beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. Ibig sabihin, mas i-pursue ng mga parties yung efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade kasi mas maraming impacts compared to the 2 degrees centigrade condition. So ang gusto nila i-maintain yung lower than 1.5 degrees centigrade as already based on experience or yung mga na nakikita ang mga impacts nasa 1. Kaya parties would like to would prefer to have the 1.5 degrees centigrade condition. And then also the findings of the synthesis report on NDCs have indicated that the aggregate greenhouse gas emission level is estimated to be 13.5% to date, 13.7% above the 2010 level in 2030. Ibig sabihin talagang nahirapan tayo. Even our NDCs are not sufficient enough to help in the achievement of the long-term global goal of the Paris Agreement. So the global warming limit to 1.5 degrees centigrade would require rapid, deep, and sustained. Yun pala yung ating new terminologies, rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, including reducing global greenhouse CO2 and other greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030 relative to the 2010 level. And of course, to attain the net zero around the mid-century, which is 2050, sorry. And further on mitigation, this would require accelerated action in this critical decade based on mga scientific knowledge and equity, especially yung mga, if we have to consider yung mga scientific knowledge that we got from reports kasama ng IPCC report, and also this yung accelerated action would always reflect or would also always take into consideration the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities in the context of SD. Basically, ang gusto natin is to eradicate poverty at the same time habang ina-accelerate natin yung action on mitigation. So the decision would also invite parties to consider further actions to reduce by 2030 non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions. This would include methane. And also sinasabi natin na there should be, sinabi natin ng mga countries that there should be acceleration in the development, deployment, and the dissemination of technologies and policies para mag-transition towards low-emission energy systems and clean power generation, as well as sinasabi natin accelerate efforts towards the originally phase out naging phase down of unabated coal power, and at least nandun pa rin ang phase out, pero phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies while supporting the poorest and most vulnerable according to national circumstances. And also nabanggit na rin yung just transition, na dapat suportahan pa rin yung just transition ng mga countries, especially the developing ones, na kung saan ay wala naman yung mga sinasabing nating greenhouse gas technologies or low greenhouse gas emitting technologies sa mga developing countries. That's why the Philippines has advocated for emissions avoidance during nung mga huling araw ng COP. Also, very important, especially to the DNR, is the protection, conservation, and restoration of nature and ecosystems as well, including forests and other terrestrial and marine ecosystems that would act as sinks and reservoir of greenhouse gases. So, na-consider na rin yung contribution ng marine ecosystems as sinks or as reservoirs of greenhouse gases. And also, at the same time, we have to protect biodiversity while ensuring social and environmental safeguards. As regards to finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, tinatawag natin needs of implementation for mitigation and adaptation action. So, ni-remind yung developed countries yung as regards their obligation under the convention. Dapat tuloy-tuloy itong kanilang obligation, and also encouraged, parties have been encouraged to provide or continue to provide support voluntarily. As to hindi ito yung sinasabi nating entitlement ng developing countries, pero kung may dagdag pa na ibang support voluntarily, then okay din naman na mayroong ganong klaseng support, financial support in terms of finance and technology transfer. And then concern on the growing needs of developing countries due to the increasing impacts of climate change na pinag-usapan din sa negotiating table. And then lalo na yung indebtedness, increased indebtedness due to coronavirus 2019 pandemic. So napapag-usapan yung COVID sa negotiating. And what else? Yung submission, recognize yung mga submission as especially yung determination of the needs of developing countries, and also the fourth biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows by the ICF or the Standing Committee on Finance. So there's also the need to mobilize climate finance from all sources. Beyond the sinasabi nating 100 billion per year na pledge ng mga developed countries under the Paris Agreement. What else? On the finance, further, there is this may expression ng regrets, especially if you have to look at paano minomobilize yung 100 billion per year by 2020 ng mga developed countries. So dapat may may nandun palagi yung meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation lalo na. So hindi pa ito nami-met. Hindi pa ito nakikita ng mga bansa, no? So although sinasabi ng mga parties na we would like to welcome increased pledges made by many developing countries, and also the climate finance delivery plan to meet the pledge na 100 billion goal US dollars, 100 billion US dollars. Also, okay, so may financial mechanism, multilateral development banks, wherein yung mga multilateral development banks and other financial institutions were also urged to further scale up investments in climate action. So may panawagan on the strengthening of cooperative action in technology development and transfer. That would also include innovations and importance of predictable, sustainable, and adequate funding. Okay, on loss and damage, I have not included here yung mga ibang decisions kasi karamihan naman doon ay puro reaffirmation or recognition of yung mga kailangan gawin as regards to support, means of implementation, and even yung how to finance loss and damage, how to provide funding for this mechanism. Pero I have just outlined these four major elements ng decision, which is yung operationalization. One is the operationalization of the Santiago network that would include agreement on its functions and process for further developing its institutional arrangements. So ito yata ang babalikan sa mga next meetings, sessions on loss and damage, and also coherent action to respond to the scale of needs caused by the adverse impacts of climate change, and then also how to strengthen partnerships between developing and developed countries as regards to funds, technical agencies, civil society, and communities that would enhance understanding kung paano ang approach to avert and address loss and damage. And also, we are looking forward to the Glasgow dialogue between parties, relevant organizations and stakeholders to discuss funding activities at the first session of the subsidiary body for implementation of each year, and then also the Glasgow dialogue will conclude in June 2024. Implementation. Okay, so maganda rin at may mga nagawa din, may mga kompleto rin. In fact, there's already a new work program that will be operationalized by parties. And isa dito is the start of the global stocktake to be na dapat we should ensure na comprehensive ito, inclusive and consistent with the Article 14 of the Paris Agreement. And the first the CMA decision during the 19th session of the CMA, and itong second bullet, ito yung mga na binabanggit ko ng mga work programs na pagkatapos ng 6 to 7 years of discussion, lumabas na yung Paris Agreement for Program. May adoption na of decisions on the common timeframes or NDCs, enhanced transparency framework, or which would kasama rito yung MRV system or the measurement, reporting and verification of data and mga reports, public registry, and very close to our hearts, so as being the lead negotiator on Article 6. Meron na tayong guidance on cooperative approaches, rules, modalities, and procedures, and work program under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And also, the collaboration, which is important, that non-party stakeholders, including civil society and indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, children, local and regional governments, and other stakeholders would have an important role sa mga sa COP sessions. And also, I would like to highlight that meron din sa Glasgow implementation of the Glasgow work program would also involve yung action for climate empowerment, especially as regards to the respective obligations on human rights, as well as gender equality and empowerment of women. And gusto ko yung highlight itong sa bullet number 3 na there should be there should be always yung participation and representation ng youth in multilateral, national, and local decision-making process, and the importance of the role ng observer organizations in sharing their knowledge and their calls for ambitious action. And beyond the Glasgow Climate Pact, may mga nangyari sa labas wherein engage ang Pilipinas. Ito lang ang alam ko, base doon sa mga kwento-kwento ng mga kaibigan na nasa labas ng negotiation rooms. So we have yung mga ibang pledges and declaration on transport and methane reduction, as well as on forestry. Nabanggit na rin ito ni Atty. Gia kanina. And implications on climate change policies and programs. Sorry po. And anyway, these are just my initial thoughts on how to ensure na may work program tayo kung paano i-localize or i-translate into local actions yung mga COP decision, yung COP26 decision. So of course, we have to revisit the Philippine NDC as na rin na napag-usapan ng mga parties na dapat mas maging ambitious siya yung NDCs natin. And then identification ng yung mga non-greenhouse gas emitting technologies as part of our policies and measures under yung ating kinukumit na NDC. As we all know, nag-advocate tayo ng emissions avoidance. So dapat isuportahan ito ng mga technologies which we would like to identify para mas may elaborate sa mga parties na ito ang ibig sabihin ng emissions avoidance. And then formulation of the National Action Plan. We have to, although the Climate Change Commission has already started working on this, initially started kung paano i-formulate or i-frame yung ating national climate change action plan. And then the cooperative action on technology development and transfer with the private sector. I know that meron na tayo mga available technologies that could support our NDC. And then work programs on the forestry and methane reduction dahil nag-commit tayo sa global pledge and declaration on this. And the others, the rest. I know this will be provided, ibang work programs will be provided by the other agencies, national agencies. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and also thank you for this invitation. Maraming salamat po.
Alright, maraming salamat po Mr. Albert Magalang of DENR, and we do hope nga po that the learnings from COP26 will help our government to achieve sustainable development and climate resilience for our country and our people. To those who are just joining us po, welcome to our forum entitled Turning Ambition into Reality, Climate Action in the Philippines after COP26 and Beyond. We are live po on the following FB pages: Aksyon Klima, Living Laudato Si, Archdiocese of Manila, Greenpeace Philippines, Economedia, LCOY, at Youth for Strike Climate. So please feel free po to share our forum for today, and please use the following hashtags po na hashtag Climate Justice Now at hashtag COP26. Moving forward po with our program, let's discuss naman po on COP26 and the pathway to decarbonization and just energy transition in the Philippines. We have with us a long-term climate and environmental advocate. He is currently working on advancing energy transformation, ecological integrity, and people-centered development as the executive director of the Center for Energy, Ecology, and Development, or SEED, and convener of the Power for People Coalition. We have with us Mr. Jerry Arances.
Hello. Yun. Good morning to everyone. Maraming salamat sa Aksyon Klima and the co-organizers, Living Laudato Si, and many others of this webinar. Very timely na pinag-uusapan natin to at approximately fresh pa din from the Glasgow summit. And marami doon sa premises nung aking topic. And thanks to the previous speakers, mula kay Vice, kay Gia of course, and then doon sa mga kasama pa natin na nagsalita, kay Albert, and then from MO, it sort of set up yung mga basic premises na hindi ko na masyadong papasadahan. But I'll concentrate more on the outcome of the Glasgow COP. And what does it mean to yung energy transition, just energy transition sa Pilipinas and then globally. So ang unang question natin lagi is overall yung outcome ba ng Glasgow COP makes us nearer or the 1.5 degree goal more achievable, or approximately mas within reach natin? Unfortunately, the answer is no. And despite yung pag-welcome natin na the conversation on reaching 1.5 degree is still on the table, at yun naman yung, kumbaga parang yun yung pronouncements ng madami ng mga parties, unfortunately, if you look at the science and you add it up, and all the outcomes ng mitigation action sa Glasgow Summit, Climate Summit, we're still in a trajectory towards 2.4 at the minimum, and probably around 3.5. So yun yung range. So kung tatanungin natin ang mga Pilipino, kung, di ba, we fought for 1.5 in the Paris Climate Summit, it doesn't really add up. And So the issue right now is, una, bakit? Kailangan natin maintindihan why is it na ganun yung naging outcome. Despite all the pronouncements ng we will work on 1.5 degree, so on and so forth, diba? And there was a lot of steam leading to COP. And secondly, ano ang implication niyan moving forward sa context natin sa loob ng Pilipinas and then sa region natin, which is Asia or Southeast Asia, which we are of course an active player as well. So binanggit na nung mga naunang speaker yung ilang key outcomes on mitigation and specific sa energy, which are one, yung unabated coal is now in the decision text. Ibig sabihin, there was a decision to control unabated coal. So maraming tanong dyan, ano yung ibig sabihin ng unabated? Secondly, bakit coal lang? And then the second na importanteng outcome doon is yung binanggit ni Albert nitong previous na presentation is the kumbaga phasing out ng fossil fuel financing. Inefficient nga lang. So quote and quote. So meron ulit kulatilya, meron ulit premise na, and then syempre ang tanong natin doon, ano ibig sabihin ng inefficient? Anong kaibahan niyan sa ibang financing? So importante din 'yon kasi once we move forward and what does that mean for the Philippines, importanteng maintindihan natin yung mga clauses na 'yon. And binanggit yung iba pa na major din, which is the methane agreement, which is also included in the text, and then yung iba pa, at syempre yung 1.5 ambition nandun pa rin sa text. So ito yung mga kumbaga kung sa energy landscape ng transition, ito yung mga importanteng aspeto na kailangan nating tingnan doon sa outcomes ng decision text. And why are we saying na it doesn't, kumbaga, bagamat may nagtutuloy yung momentum towards achieving 1.5 degrees at hindi binibitawan na goal, ay hindi, kumbaga, hindi nag-add up towards mas malapit na pag-achieve dito sa outcome na to. And importante dyan yung pagsagot natin ng anong ibig sabihin ng mga phrases na yon. And especially sa context. It's always important for us to navigate sa mga ganitong komperensya ng what the real world is at. Yung context niya. So coming into COP, there are from our end, from SEED's end, merong apat na key context on the energy aspect. Una, before the COP, merong study na lumabas na ano ang pinupondohan ng G20 governments and mainly the OECD governments. And ang finding nung study na yon, which was done by Friends of the Earth USA, I think OCI was also involved, All Change International, and many other mainly US-based organizations, NGOs, which basically says that majority, more than 50% of the financing from the last 3 years before this COP is on fossil fuel financing. So imaginein mo na after Paris Agreement na ang public funds ng G20 governments ay mainly on fossil fuel financing. Okay? So importante yan. And secondly, yung renewable energy financing nila ay kumbaga ang fossil fuel, ang ratio is 2:1. Ibig sabihin, doble yung fossil fuel financing kumpara sa renewable energy financing. So that is where the big governments, o kung sa parlance ng Climate Change Convention, the Annex 1 countries, including the emerging economies. Pag sinabi mo emerging economies, these are China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and yung mga ganong klaseng mga bansa. But the OECD countries comprises the biggest chunk ng financing na yun. So importante yun kasi ibig sabihin nun, yun yung standing nila coming into the COP. So i-evaluate mo lagi ano ang pronouncement at dun sa realidad na kinalalagyan nila. And how do they navigate around it? How do they raise their ambition, so on and so forth, right? And the second context is that in the last 5 years, the global coal expansion ng coal plants in the world, 9 out of 10 of that is in Asia. 9 out of 10. Ibig sabihin, 90% ng coal expansion sa buong mundo is in Asia. Led by China, India, which comprises 80% of the expansion, and then followed by Southeast Asia of around 15%. Nagbago naman na yan significantly. Pero I'm just presenting that para makita natin ano ang motivations ng lahat ng agreement na to. Saan nagmula siya at gaano ka-difficult. And in order for us to weave around it, kailangan nating i-address yung context na yun. The third context is that the LNG or liquefied natural gas expansion, which is imported, 70% of that projected from now to 2050 will be in Asia. 70%. So, pag binilikan natin, lahat ng reports that says, like the IPCC, which was touched by Gia and the Dr. Faye, ay makikita natin doon na ito yung green future. Pero at the same time, ang sinasabi ng realities is that Asia is expanding rapidly on the very source that creates this crisis. So, importante na we actually put that into perspective. At the same time, issue ng equity, of course, within the context of the global negotiation. Yung last context na gusto kong banggitin is where the Philippines is at. At dito mo makikita kung magre-raise ba ng ambition ng Pilipinas o hindi. So, pag sinabi nating unabated, and I'd like to raise this kasi lahat ng media coverage has castrated India. Right? Castrated India because of the last minute na insertion niya o pagpalit niya ng phase out to phase down. Right? Castrated talaga siya because of alam ng lahat that coal is one of the biggest culprit ng global warming and thus climate change. But kailangan nating ilugar sa context. The first proposition ng doon sa negotiation, India and China. But the first proposition is actually the phase out of coal, oil, and gas. Okay? Because science is saying, kaya importante yung science, and I really appreciate yung presentation ng MO, kasi importante that our decisions on climate change should be basically based on science. There are 2 reports, IPCC report and the IEA report that came out, which basically says na there is no more room for new coal, oil, and gas projects in order for the world to achieve or to still achieve 1.5 degrees. So kung ito yung context at iyon yung unang proposal sa text, bakit ang kinalabasan ay phase down unabated coal? Una, who were the ones who struck out oil and gas? It's the developed countries. Developed countries led by the US and UK. Bakit? And this was proposed by Oasis and SEEDS. Ibig sabihin, group of countries, ng mga island countries, because they know their fate, and actually approximating tayo dyan, relies on the, sabi nga ni Albert, radical, mabilis na phase out. It was struck down. So, hindi ang India at ang China ang unang naglabas ng baraha. Because oil and gas is mainly now used in developed countries, particularly the European countries, the US, and many other Northern Hemisphere countries, mga OECD countries. So, yung context na yon played out. And we have to, kumbaga parang raise that issue. Kasi in order for us to be able to raise the ambition, kailangan talaga, di ba, we confront the issue ng diretso. Doon sa unabated, bakit unabated? Kasi simple lang yun. And this was a decision ng G20 before the COP. And ang pinakalaman ng kung bakit unabated is it means that unabated means na pwedeng mag-allow ng coal plants as long as merong mga technologies which includes CCS, carbon capture and storage mechanism. Pero the actual work plan or the mechanisms in the implementation of that phrase, open pa yun. Open pa yun sa discussion and debates. So, nandun, ang next na phase ng labanan niyan ay dun sa paano i-flesh out yung mechanisms around it. Kasi for now, ang consensus ay kapag ang isang coal plant projects ay walang CCS na technology, ay hindi siya i-allow, ay hindi siya ipo-fund, hindi siya ipo-promote. Okay? Ngayon, pagdating doon sa inefficient fossil fuel financing, inefficient basically means that there are subsidies na efficient. Okay? Yun ang ibig sabihin nun. So, ang kaibahan kaagad nun, yung subsidies na ibinibigay ng developed countries sa companies nila or sa mga agreements na involve ang companies nila, pwedeng absuelto yun. Pwede kasing efficient na subsidies yun. Okay? So, nandun ang debate. So, it's actually, at the end of the day, it's about protecting yung kanya-kanyang interest. Kanya-kanyang interest ng developed countries and developing countries. So, importante yun na maintindihan natin yun. And importante na after this, post-COP, ay alam natin kung ano dapat ang gawin natin. Alam dapat natin kung paano natin i-engage, including our Philippine government. Yung last context na binabanggit ko and ano ang implication nitong dalawang ito, including yung buyout mechanism na binanggit na rin ng mga naunang speaker. How does that what does that mean now to us and the Philippine government? Yung fourth na binabanggit kong context na importante, coming into COP, pag tiningnan nyo ang Philippine Energy Plan and the nationally determined contribution ng Pilipinas, bagamat ambitious, which is 75%, although pag mayroon ng mga sumilip na it doesn't equate to 1.5 degrees, pag tiningnan mo to the fullest, to the details, ay marami pa rin coal plants doon. Marami pa rin, mas madaming gas doon. So that's why the Philippines, in all the side agreements, in COP, alam mo kung saan siya nagmumula. Alam mo kung anong interest din ang pinoprotektahan niya. But siguro medyo limited yung oras. I'll end with anong ibig sabihin for us sa Pilipinas. Ang una kong gustong i-highlight is that the momentum for 1.5 degrees, bagamat malayo, is still alive. Yun ang pinaka-importante for us. Yun ang pinaka-importante for us. And we have to hold on that. And in engaging the Philippine government, yun yung kailangan nating North Star lagi. That we keep that in mind in engaging whether kung ano man ang magaganap sa Pilipinas. Second, I'll end with this. Ang pinaka-importante is ang target based on PEP. Pag Philippine Energy Plan mula ngayon hanggang 2040, it's around 35% lang ang renewable energy. 10 years ago, when we crafted and promulgated the renewable energy law, we were 34%. Ang target ngayon, mula ngayon hanggang 2030 ng Pilipinas is 35%. So that is way unambitious. At kailangan yung isubject. At yung last 2 points ko dito is, one, kaya importante that all climate change na negosasyon, climate change issues and discussions should actually be transparent, should actually be engaging multi-sector. At dito sa naganap, sa COP na ito, walang naganap na engagement with civil society, walang consultation na naganap. So importante yon. Lastly, doon sa raising ambition. So mula ngayon hanggang election next year, importante that we raise the issue ng pagtaas ng ambisyon on renewable energy from 35% by 2030 to 50% by 2030. That's the only way that we can approximate ang usapin ng equity, ang usapin ng accessibility, at usapin ng raising the ambition para i-achieve ang climate ambition. Thank you.
Alright, maraming salamat po Sir Jerry sa paglalatag po ng pathway to decarbonization and just energy. Ayan, nakikita na po ba ako? Alright, salamat po Sir Jerry sa paglalatag po ng pathway to decarbonization and just energy transition in the Philippines. Now naman po, to focus on the COP26 implication to the Commission on Human Rights or CHR case on carbon major polluters, we have with us the Executive Director at Greenpeace Southeast Asia, and he also leads po the diverse operations in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand since 2015. Siya rin po ay nagsilbi bilang commissioner with the rank of Undersecretary of the Philippines Climate Change Commission, the country's lead policy-making body on climate change. He also served po as the Philippines Chief Negotiator in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mga kasama po natin si Mr. Yeb Sanyo of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Hi Sir Yeb!
Maraming salamat, Jermaine, at magandang umaga sa ating lahat. I'm assuming na nasa Pilipinas karamihan ng ating sumusubaybay sa ating talakayan. If I may just also share my screen. And ayan, nakikita nyo ba ang aking screen?
Yes po, Sir Yeb. Go ahead po.
So, again, maraming salamat sa imbitasyon para makasama kayong lahat ngayong umaga para dito sa isang importanteng diskusyon sa mangyayari sa COP26. At ang duty ko po ngayon, my task is to give you a picture of the implications of the outcome of COP26 on the landmark petition that was filed with the Commission on Human Rights 6 years ago na po yung pag-file nitong petition na to. And we're anticipating the release of the final report from the CHR sometime soon. No? And ito pong topic na to is really crucial in the context of what happened in COP26. So it's really important for us to reflect on what happens next and anong implikasyon nga nito. The human rights petition in the CHR is premised on the idea that big polluters need to be held accountable, and the notion of climate justice is about the fact that, and not just the fact, but the whole unfairness of it, that those who have contributed the least doon po sa problema ng climate crisis are those who suffer the most, no, from the brunt of its impacts, and those who are supposedly responsible for the climate crisis, those who have emitted a lion's share of emissions, of carbon emissions, they remain unaccountable. At makikita rin natin yan sa discussion natin throughout this. But I want to first raise this question. Kaya ba talaga nating matugunan itong climate crisis through international negotiations? So I've always been fascinated with this question. Can we negotiate our way out of this crisis? And as Jermaine mentioned, naging bahagi rin tayo katulad nila Albert, nila Gia, nila Jerry dun sa Philippine Delegation sa maraming panahon, no? And bilang isang former negotiator para sa bansa, syempre nasasabi ko rin na nag-invest din tayo ng panahon, ng pagod, ng luha, no? Para panindigan yung interest ng ating bansa. And naniwala tayo, no, for at least sa isang banda, naniwala tayo na maaring pwede nating matugunan ito through negotiations. And after all, it's probably the most important aspect of solving the climate crisis kasi hindi naman ito masosolve na isang bansa lamang. It needs a global response. That's why global international cooperation is not just important, but it's necessary. We have no choice but for countries to agree on ways to solve the climate crisis. And alam din natin na marami tayong nakikitang mga debate, lalo na dyan sa Glasgow at COP26. Matindi yung mga debate. Pero masasabi ko, since I've been following the process since 1997, attending close to 20 COPs in the past, masasabi ko na paulit-ulit naman talaga yung debate. Halos wala namang bagong issue. And fundamentally, it's about those responsible for the crisis not taking accountability. At yung mga tinatamaan ng climate crisis, sila yung nagpo-push na magkaroon ng stronger, more ambitious climate action. And this reminds me of what Maurice Strong said during the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 when the UNFCCC was actually born. At sinabi niya, history reminds us that what is not possible today may be inevitable tomorrow. So ganyan yung nangyayari sa climate negotiations. Kahit na sabihin nating imposibleng magkaroon ng gantong agreement, whether it's a placement of a comma or the period or kung anong agreement yung kailangan ma-decide in any COP. Kung tingin natin imposible yun ngayon, in the next COP it might be inevitable. And that's what we saw somehow in Glasgow. Alam nyo yung term na fossil fuels or at least fossil fuel subsidies, hindi pa yan nabanggit kahit isang beses in any UNFCCC COP decision. Ganun din yung phase down of coal power, hindi pa yan nabanggit at all in any past decision. So medyo historic yan. Of course, very watered down, very weak yung context. At katulad na nabanggit ni Jerry, marami ring hindi na isama dyan, katulad ng oil at gas. No? So while we look at the surface of the text, we really have to confront the reality na mahirap talaga yung negosasyon. And it involves 196 countries plus one observer country. Hindi ganun kasimple yan. And it will require cooperation and compromise. And ultimately, after all is said and done, as they say, when the dust settles, hindi ka makakakuha ng agreement that will make everyone happy. Now, nabanggit na ni Dr. Faye kanina, no, yung science. But I just really, and Gia also emphasized the backdrop of COP26, which was the recent release of the IPCC AR6 report. My discussion today focuses on two questions, really, based on the implication, in relation to the implications on the CHR petition. So, dalawa yan kasi the CHR in its national inquiry had examined closely two things: the science as well as the justice aspect of the climate crisis and how it's infringing on human rights, on basic human rights, and how those the climate crisis, which is traced to human activities, in particular for the fossil fuel industry and the activities of rich nations, how that is inflicting and causing human rights harms. No? So yan ang tinignan ng CHR. So we want to know whether the COP26 passed the climate science test. Kanina nabanggit na ni Doc Faye yung nangyayari in terms of science, what the IPCC has highlighted. And we all know that 2020, even through the pandemic, has tied 2016 as the warmest year on record. And the headline from the IPCC when they released the report was that climate change is widespread, no, widespread, rapid, and intensifying. No, palala ng palala, mabilis na mabilis, at saka pangmalawakan yung epekto nito. So kung yan yung nangyayari, ang ibig niyan sabihin, ang sinasabi ng science sa atin, if we don't take enough ambitious action, deep reductions yung kanilang term, deep reductions in the coming decades, we will not be able to meet the 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees or even the 2 degrees target. No? So yan ang sinasabi ng science. So science is very clear, and that's why the young people of today are clamoring with the governments to stand behind the science. Kasi the science is clear. Wala na dapat debate dyan. And unfortunately, even if the science is really clear, and even if the UN Climate Convention was adopted in 1992, the concentrations of greenhouse gases continues to rise. In fact, it has risen by 38% since 1992. So are we solving this problem and achieving the objective of the convention, which is to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Obviously not. No, emissions are still rising, and climate change impacts are continuing to accelerate profoundly. I'm not gonna go into detail on that. I think a lot of us have heard this earlier, and it's remarkable. It's remarkable what's happening, and so this is a sobering reminder to all of us na the climate crisis is affecting real people, real livelihoods. Pero may isa akong gustong i-highlight because I feel vindicated about this. You know, when Super Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines in 2013, of course, ang instinct natin is to link it to climate change. Why? Because we have the data. Pag-asa has the data. We have indications that stronger typhoons are gonna affect the Philippines. But for the very first time, the IPCC in the sixth assessment report says that category 3 to 5 typhoons or cyclones will increase in frequency, no, as a climate extreme. So this is for the first time, no, related to the special report on 1.5. But this is the first assessment report where the IPCC is categorically saying that these intense storms or typhoons will increase in frequency. So again, as I said, hindi kaya ng isang bansa ito. It requires a global response. And you know, the Paris Agreement had moved forward a little bit in terms of establishing that vision and including the temperature threshold goal, the 1.5 degrees goal, as we call it, to avoid catastrophic climate change. So did the first question nga, no, did Glasgow pass the climate science test, and therefore how does that affect the CHR inquiry? The answer is definitely no. Based on the NDCs on the table from all the countries that have submitted, we are still moving towards somewhere around 2.5 degrees of warming. That's very far from the 1.5 degrees goal, and even way above the 2 degrees goal. So malayong malayo sa require ng science. The second question is, does it pass the climate justice test? This conversation about the implications on the CHR inquiry is really about whether these international conferences, the climate summits pass the climate justice test. So while nations attempt to avoid the unmanageable, and avoiding the unmanageable, ayan yung sinasabi na tinatawag nating adaptation, mitigation. Yung iniiwasan natin yung hindi natin kaya i-manage. And managing the unavoidable is adaptation. We have to manage what we cannot avoid. Itong mga climate negotiations na ito, they continue to become venues for countries with with so much influence and power and with the highest emissions to continue to wield power and influence in order to continue with business as usual. So even assuming that each nation that signed on to the Paris Agreement really wants to solve this crisis, yung pledges na nasa table are real distantly far from what science requires and what equity standards would demand. So yung industries, in particular, the fossil fuel industry, oil, gas, coal, cement, that contributed the lion's share of emissions, including, I would say, industrial meat and other extractive and polluting corporations. They continue to profit, no? And sadly, they even spout greenwashing slogans, no, that they're doing good in terms of their environmental programs, and publicly patting themselves on the back for token efforts that in reality do little to actually curb their emissions and build their integrity. No? So while the investments of these big corporations, big polluters, are making it difficult to fight for climate justice in the halls of global climate negotiations, alam natin na may pag-asa tayo in certain venues such as the CHR. Kaya sana magkaroon ng energy coming from COP26, whatever the outcome was, to push the CHR to come up with the strongest resolution ever, no, for the petition. Alam din naman natin itong mga conferences na to, sinong nagpo-pull ng strings. And unfortunately, even at COP26, sino ba may pinakamalaking delegation? Hindi civil society, hindi Global South, hindi vulnerable countries. It's the fossil fuel industry that had the largest delegation at the climate summit. You would even see fossil fuel industry executives in the delegations of official delegations of countries. So yan yung nangyayari. And in the CHR, the petition we filed was against originally 50 corporations, now down to 47 because some have dissolved and merged. But all of these companies, they were represented quite well in the in COP26. And unlike many voices from the Global South who suffered from the brutal vaccine inequality, buti pa yung fossil fuel industry, yung oil, gas, and coal industry, matindi yung representation dyan. So, what is another takeaway from COP26 that has implications on on anything for that matter, including the Philippines response, including what happens to the CHR petition, is that COP26 overall, katulad ng naipaliwanag na nila Jerry kanina at ni Albert, I mean, may konting gains naman dyan. These are small steps, but overall, if you read the text of the Glasgow Climate Pact, it's basically saying, see you in Egypt, which is the next venue for COP27. They're kicking the can down the road again. And kicking the can down the road in the face of the IPCC code read for humanity, that's irresponsible, that's unethical. And, diplomatic compromise has this tendency to kick the can down the road because they've run out of time to get to a stronger agreement. Yan yung taon-taon nangyayari. And, this was 2 years in the making, itong COP26 because of the delay. So, to wrap up, how does it really impact the CHR National Inquiry? Ang inaasahan kasi natin, itong national inquiry, of course, will continue to happen. And as I said, this is based on the notion of climate justice, and justice is what is lacking in terms of the climate crisis conversation. It has mostly been about who benefits the most from this, right? And it's also a conversation around finger pointing, sinong gagawa ng bigger actions to solve the climate crisis. But justice should sit at the heart of this. And ang signal na dapat makuha ng CHR dito is that I think mainly two things. One is the more that human rights petitions related to the climate crisis should be given attention and should be taken more seriously. Dahil hindi nagmo-move fast enough yung international climate negotiations. It's not sending the strongest signals that is required. So therefore, venues like the CHR, venues like courts of law should act with dispatch, with alacrity, with enthusiasm to uphold climate justice. Yan dapat na maging epekto niyan. After all, the climate crisis is one of the biggest injustices in human history. And even the UNFCCC has stipulated the responsibility. Sino ba talagang may kagagawan? Sinasabi ng UNFCCC in the Climate Convention, the largest share of historical and current global emissions has originated in developed countries. No, of course, yung definition ng developed countries nagbabago yan, pero it's also pretty much clearer into focus now, based on very recent studies na the industry is responsible for a lion's share of emissions. In fact, just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas. Meaning, itong crisis na ito, 100 na kumpanya lang ang responsible for this. Mabibilang natin itong mga companies na to, may mga addresses sila, may mga CEO yan na dapat managot. And going back to the goal, as Jerry had emphasized, 1.5 degrees, this is really central to the Paris Agreement. This is central to achieving justice. If we don't meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, we're not exacting justice. And ano ibig sabihin nito? Ibig sabihin nito, unang-una, kailangan yung natitirang 80% ng fossil fuels in the ground should stay in the ground. And then pangalawa, there's 420 gigatons of carbon budget left. Actually, a lot less now, no? This is less than 420 by now. And kailangan yan magkaroon tayo ng maayos na pag-allocate niyan. And most of that remaining budget should be given to developing countries. And thirdly, dapat may finance. No? Finance should be forthcoming for developing countries, for the global south to enable the just transition. Hindi na natin gayahin yung mga mistakes ng mga industrialized countries. Just as an emphasis, 80% ng fossil fuels. And the petition in the CHR is about those fossil fuel companies, no? So ang ibig sabihin nito, kailangan na talagang tutukan itong issue na ito ng human rights institutions and make it very clear, strongest message possible to the industry. After all, COP26 has already mentioned, no, babanggitin ko lang ulit, the term fossil fuel was substantively mentioned for the first time in the outcome text. Hindi pa yan nangyari before. Medyo mahina naman yung reference, ano, nakalagay lang urges all parties or calls on all parties. Mahina naman yun, wala namang effect masyado pag sinabi mong calls on, nananawagan ka lang, no. So wala namang ngipin talaga yon. Pero at least nandiyan na yan for the first time. There is this indication na fossil fuels need to be phased out in terms of those subsidies at least for the time being. And then nabanggit ni Jerry yung phase down of coal power. This is the first time. So this should signal to the CHR na ito na, nangyayari na itong mga mensahe na ito coming from the international community in a historic way because hindi ito nababanggit dati. And therefore, ma-uphold natin, no, yung principle that human rights should sit at the heart of the climate crisis conversation. Ano nangyari sa COP26? A lot of groups, a lot of delegations tried their best to insert human rights into the Article 6 negotiations. No? Unfortunately, naging mahirap yung discussion na yan. Human rights already has been mentioned in the Paris Agreement. No? So, nandun pa rin naman siya sa outcome text ng Glasgow and we should continue to push for that. It should also send a signal to the CHR that human rights is becoming even more mainstreamed into the international climate negotiations. No? Pera ang pag-usapan, unfortunately, kulang talaga. And finance, despite some positive signals, including some contributions for financing loss and damage, it still remains very uncertain. It still remains woefully inadequate to what has been promised. Kasi it should depend on what has been promised. They promised $100 billion per year by 2020. Hindi pa nga nila namimit yung $100 billion 2021 na. So that erodes the trust in the process. And then loss and damage, napaliwanag na ni Albert to, but the further enhancement of the loss and damage conversation in the UNFCCC should signal to all of us, should signal to the CHR that indeed adaptation is no longer adequate and possible for many communities. So loss and damage is also related to our petition in the CHR because a lot of communities are incurring losses and damages in the face of the climate crisis. Meron din akong gusto isang emphasize in the context of whether COP26 passes the climate justice test. The problem is magkakaroon ng carbon trading under the new regime. There will be carbon offsets. So even if Albert did his best to negotiate for our interests, magkaroon ng safeguards, carbon offsets has no place today in the climate regime kasi we are in a climate emergency. To allow rich nations and these corporations that we have filed a complaint against, they will continue emitting their carbon emissions and they will pay projects in developing countries so that they can get away with it. Parang magsisimba sila sa church sa linggo para from Monday to Saturday pwede silang maging makasalanan. Yan yung problema dito. And we cannot afford this anymore. There's no room for offsetting. We need absolute emissions reductions. Hindi na pwede yung mga offset na yan. Unfortunately, it still has a life, and then lalo nga nabuhay yung offsets, even if the rule book has put in place some transparency mechanisms there. So again, in closing, ano ba yung magiging implikasyon? The fossil fuel industry, alam naman nila lahat ito eh. But they continue to insist to uh, to dismantle their business model. Gusto nilang magpatuloy, mag-perpetuate yung kanilang kapangyarihan at yung kanilang profits. And therefore, Glasgow miserably failed to fulfill the demands of science and justice. No? Yan yung problema. So bagsak tayo dyan sa science and justice test. Maybe on the political test, maybe ayos lang. No? Baka sakto lang kasi yun lang yung kayang magawa. And ang daming unfulfilled promises eh. So ano ba yung aasahan natin dito sa proseso na to? Ang signal na ito, wag nating masyadong asahan, no? Kasi mabagal. So therefore, ang impact implications dapat nito sa atin when we pursue creative legal actions in courts of law or in human rights institutions, importante na lalong sabihin na the crisis is escalating. Did we avert climate change in Glasgow? Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, no. Is that cause for alarm? Absolutely yes, no. That's cause for alarm. So, balikan tanong, ano ibig sabihin to sa CHR? I think the on the shoulders of the CHR is a big responsibility. But I think if we rally behind the CHR and clamor for the transformation required by the world, we will overcome. After all, itong dependence natin on the decisions of the international community will have to temper it down kasi 26 na COPs na yan eh. Palagi namang little steps lang and always too little. So global action, local response, importante yan. And finally, back to the question, can we negotiate our way out of this crisis? I think there's only one answer. We must. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat po, Sir Yeb Sanyo. Ang tama po, we really need to act now, establish system, and join institutions such as CHRs and the courts in order to ensure justice for the victims of climate injustices. And also po, human rights should always be at the heart of climate justice negotiations. This part of the forum, we will be having a moderated panel discussion on the role of the Filipino youth in climate action after COP26. This discussion will be moderated by a young individual who devoted much of his personal and professional life advocating for environmental journalism and working in the fields of youth development and peace building, and currently serves as the executive director of the Association of Young Environmental Journalists and works part-time as a college instructor at Xavier University Ateneo de Cagayan. Everyone, we have with us Mr. Val Amiel Vestil. Hi, Val.
Hi, Jermaine. Thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I think it's very apt that we follow the presentation of Sir Yeb Sanyo, which was insightful and very powerful and really made us think more about the context and implications of what had occurred during COP26. Now, we head on over to the panel discussion where we engage with young people who attended COP26 in Glasgow. I was witness to how young people and youth movements had actively engaged during COP26. And by active engagement, I really mean being at the front lines of the strikes, speaking with government leaders, attending press conferences, expressing thoughts during discussions, say on loss and damage. We are thrilled to have 3 of the many young people who made their presence felt at COP26. Allow me to introduce them. Our first youth panelist is climate activist and artist Jefferson Estela. He's a visual storyteller from the Philippines who humanizes activism and storytelling to connect people with the environment. He co-founded the Youth Strike for Climate Philippines, one of the leading youth-led climate movements in the country to empower the Filipino youth to act against the climate crisis and demand climate justice. He attended the recently concluded COP26 in the UK and is currently a member of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, the broadest alliance of youth from the global north and south who have come together to demand action on addressing loss and damage caused by climate change. Magandang umaga sa iyo, Jefferson.
Hey everyone, magandang umaga po.
Our second youth panelist is an advocate for climate justice and the environment. She is a registered social worker and one of the founders of the Youth Leaders for Environmental Action, Federation, a youth-led organization based in Eastern Visayas that aims to mentor youth individuals and organizations in climate advocacy. She's also the advocacy officer for ecological justice and youth engagement of Living Laudato Si Philippines. She's currently the Philippine country coordinator for UN COP26 Glasgow, while co-leading the implementation of one of the most comprehensive youth gatherings this year, which is the Local Conference of Youth 2021. She also serves as the Philippine focal point for Climate Science Olympiad. Marinelle has been actively involved in educating communities, especially the youth and children, about climate change and the roles they can take to adapt and mitigate its effects. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are, Marinelle.
Hello, good morning.
And
Very
finally,
early in the morning.
and finally, to wrap up to complete our set of panelists, we have Mitzi Janelle Tan. She's a full-time climate justice activist based in Metro Manila, Philippines. She's the convener and international spokesperson of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, or YACAP, the Fridays for Future, FFF of the Philippines. She's also an organizer with FFF International and FFF MAPA, or Most Affected in Peoples and Areas, making sure that voices from the Global South especially are heard, amplified, and given space. She decided to fully commit her life to activism in 2017 after integrating with the Lumad indigenous leaders of her country, which pushed her to realize that collective action and system change is what we need for a just and green society. She's committed to fight alongside the most marginalized towards a system that prioritizes people and planet, not profit. Mitzi, it's nice to have you here. Hi, Mitzi, are you there? Yeah, Mitzi is here.
Hello po. Good morning.
Good morning, Mitzi. Thanks for being here with us. Let's kick off the discussion with a general question that we will be asking our panelists, and then we can move forward with the conversation from there. Siguro ang ating banner question or ang tanong na ating gustong itanong sa ating mga youth panelists is, what are your assessments of COP26 outcomes? We came into COP26 with 4 goals, and we ended up with a Glasgow Climate Pact. Galing sa perspective ng kabataan, from a young person's lens and point of view, what do you think of these outcomes? Let's start with Marinelle.
Well, up until now, actually, I'm still processing all the thoughts that I had and all the learnings that I have gained in COP26. And alam naman natin na lahat, I mean, so many of our climate activists, no, ang dami nagkasakit even during COP up until now. We're still trying to recover. And still, kahit we have been talking to a lot of events, trying to say our perspective on the outcome. Up until now, I couldn't say that I really processed everything. But you know, the COP26 made me realize that actually, I mean, at first I realized that our leaders are actually capable of responding and addressing to urgent calls, and that is evident to how our global leaders have addressed COVID-19. And I acknowledge actually the important announcement and pledges of COP26 to curb emissions, including the doubling of adaptation finance by $40 billion by 2025. And as climate impacts are every year becoming stronger, I just think that our leaders could have done more, and loss and damage must be at the top agenda for COP27. And COP26 failed to agree on whether to create the loss and damage fund. It is the loss and damage fund, kanina nga sinabi, it is a repatriation or a compensation for climate vulnerable countries for damages resulting from emissions we did not create, and the climate vulnerable countries did not create. So we were hoping to see concrete plans and drastic action to cut emissions. We were told that COP26 is our last chance to address the climate crisis. but this COP has failed to provide immediate assistance for people in the frontline communities. And reading the 11 pages Glasgow Climate Pact and talking with a lot of climate activists, we have agreed that, sabi nga kanina din ni Mr. Yab Samyo, that for the first time in a COP text, nations agreed to begin reducing coal-fired power without carbon capture. They start eliminate subsidies on the fossil fuels. However, following the objections from China and India, the promise and earlier draft of the text to phase out coal was changed to phase down, and that is one of those that frustrates people actually, and that kind of made the outcome weak. I also acknowledge the commitment of the outcome to continue working the definition of the climate finance that would be acceptable for all countries. Even Alok Sharma said before the conclusion of COP26 that the ambitions have fallen short of the commitments made in Paris. He said that we have kept 1.5 degrees alive, but its pulse is weak, and it will only survive if we keep our promises and translate commitments into rapid action. And we saw so many priorities that have been delayed. There was a lack of representation from the most vulnerable populations, though they have been saying that nung last COP, this COP has a record-breaking number of delegates. Pero nakita din natin kanina sa presentation ng Mr. Sanyo na the biggest delegation was not actually from Global South nor from the CSOs. It was from fossil fuel industries. And COP26 promised us to be the most inclusive and equitable COP, just to be the total opposite. And we all know those who came to those who went to COP that the venue was very big and it was inaccessible. And it was really big. Kasi nag-bleed na din yung mga paa namin, going from blue zone to green zone just to catch events. Anyway, as leaders from rich countries gathered in Glasgow, the COP outcome reflects the priorities of the rich countries, and our leaders failed to phase out the fossil fuels, and the rich countries are not yet paying the climate debt. There were a lot of greenwashing that happened even inside the blue zone. CSOs of big fossil fuel industries were given the front seats and easy access to the leaders and negotiators, while representatives from the marginalized sectors are at the back row of the seats, and sometimes kept outside the plenary hall, and often not listened to, or if heard, not considered. So yun yung parang those are my thoughts, and I'm still trying to process everything. Pero yun yung parang I have realized a week at least, or more than a week after COP26. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marinel. Gusto ko yung sinabi mo on turning commitments into rapid action. Parang relasyon lang yan, di ba? Mag-commit ka in the start of a relationship, tapos hindi mo pa panindigan. I'm just trying to lighten the mood kasi sobrang high level na ating conversation. This is a youth panel, so I want to break the chain. But it's a very serious matter, and I think just to wrap up what Marinel said, she mentioned that leaders could have done more, and I think she was repeating it over and over again. It was hard to process the outcomes of the COP26 because so much was happening during the actual COP26 and so much more, especially with different analysis and commentaries on the COP26 outcomes. Marinel also said that funds... Sorry, Marinel, yeah.
Yeah, I just also would like to say that though it is overwhelming, COP26 was overwhelming, yung mga nangyari was overwhelming, but the result is underwhelming. Just to put it out there.
Ayan. Very quotable quote po, no? Sa lahat ng media na nakikinig. The event was overwhelming, but the results were underwhelming. Thoughts? How about you, Jeff? What did you think of the outcomes of COP26 from where you stand as a young person from the Philippines?
Yeah, siguro maybe ulit-ulit na nating sinasabi from the previous speaker, and it was also highlighted by Marinel, and I believe Mitzi will also highlight this after na since it's my first time to be in COP, it's really, you know, I'm having a hard time to parse everything because we coming to COP, marami tayong expectations, but yet hindi natin na-meet yung mga expectations na yon, no? I was asked by many people what's my assessment. I keep on saying I'm still processing everything, but from the past 2 weeks after COP, I've been writing down my assessments. So first, syempre, COP26 failed. We've come to Glasgow because COP has been running for 25 years already with no noticeable effect on the emissions curve. And the 26th edition this year tremendously failed. I believe much of the evidence are already laid out by the previous speakers. The summit failed to produce the radical action we need to avoid climate collapse. Second, it was also mentioned by Marinelle earlier that the conference is overwhelming, especially for us first-timers, yet the outcomes are underwhelming. It's funny and sad at the same time that we already have the science and the evidence that the climate crisis is happening, and we need to treat this or the climate crisis as a crisis, but our leaders won't do anything about it. Again, taking genuine climate action, it does not requires us to, you know, have big speeches, flowery words, conferences. We just need to act. These people in power just need to act based on what science is telling us. No compromise and no empty promises. Third, nabanggit na din, there are more fossil fuel lobbyists more than any delegates for a single country at the summit. And it's crazy. You know, as COP26 unravels in the same predictable way as that COP25 came before it, it's important to understand why this process seems to fail every time. Because maybe, just maybe, if enough people understand the fatal flaw on COP process, we can get critical mass behind fixing it. Again, you can't negotiate an effective climate solution when your conference is full of fossil fuel lobbyists. You know, nakakalungkot dahil we have that pool of people who are there. And if the fossil fuel industry were a country, if they are a country delegate in COP, it would have had more representative at COP than any other country in the world. Number 4, there is a massive greenwashing and delaying tactics. Akala ko sa science fiction movies ko lang mapapanood yung mga politicians na hindi niniwala sa science or pinagkakakitaan yung natural resources, no? Well, guess it's been happening at COP for 25 years. And this year, for example, loss and damage funding will move for discussion next year in the next COP. Seriously, next COP? At may next COP pa talaga. The scale of the challenges ahead means there's no time for us to be, you know, diverted by greenwashing and meaningless corporate promises, not much by delivery. It's time for our politicians to show that they are serious about ending the influence of big polluters over political decision making and commit to a future where experts and activists' voices are given center stage. And maybe fifth point, it's the most exclusive COP ever. UK government failed to ensure the accessibility for everyone in COP26. Everyone is impacted by vaccine inequality, funding shortfalls, quarantine, visa backlogs, thus not being able to participate in COP26. I know a lot of people, colleagues, friends, activists na hindi nakarating sa COP26 na should have been there, no? The government of UK has missed all of its self-imposed deadlines to provide access to vaccines, for example, for millions of people in poorer countries, predominantly in the global south. For example, we experience skyrocketing costs for accommodations to COP26. And I'm always traveling 30 minutes papunta sa venue because wala kaming venue in the wala kaming accommodation near the venue, and it's so hard for everyone. And this failure is particularly devastating those on the front lines of the climate change battle, especially in the global south. Yeah, I think that's most of my assessment so far.
Thank you, Jeff. In summary, I think Jeff was trying to say, and he explicitly said that his expectations were not met, unmet expectations. Sabi nila, the greatest frustrations in life come from unmet expectations. Kaya siguro frustrated si Jeff. Also, Jeff expressed how he thinks that the COP26 failed, referencing that this is because there is no evident emission curb. At I think sabi din ni Jeff kanina na what use is a climate conference kung yung mga fossil fuel lobbyists, sila naman ang at the forefront of the attendance at COP26. Mitzi, I came up to you during the youth climate strikes and you had no more voice because I'm sure you were like really up there in the strikes, telling the leaders what they're supposed to know about. What were your thoughts being at the forefront of the climate strikes now that the COP26 outcomes are up? You have around 2 to 3 minutes for this answer. Please go ahead, Mitzi.
I have my voice back.
Good job.
Happily.
Great job. Happy to
of all,
hear that.
I think I mean nasabi na over and over. It's so hard to process, and I think the reason why it's so hard for us to process it is because the betrayal that happened by the so-called leaders is so unfathomable and so difficult to really swallow. Even if, I personally came into COP knowing that it is a conference born out of this global north-centric imperialist profit-oriented system, knowing that it's not going to solve everything, but I had a little bit of hope from the leaders, and that was all crushed. And I think it just really goes to show that there were even some really progressive global south leaders who were really pouring their hearts out about the loss and damages that are happening today. But what did the global north leaders do? They continued to greenwash, they continued to lie, they continued to point fingers at the global south countries. We saw that there was, as Marinelle mentioned in the text, the framing of unabated coal. So that means there's still caveats, there's still conditions for inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Like all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient. Like they should all be removed. And there's a lot of blaming being done in India and China, which I completely agree that they should bring down their fossil fuel usage as much as possible, just as the rest of the world. But the US and the UK and Japan and Australia were the ones who were blocking a lot of mention on oil and gas also, because that's where they profit off of. And they were blocking the climate finance and reparations that are needed from the global north to the global south so that we can actually phase down and not just phase out from fossil fuels. And I think that's something that we really, really need to push down on as not just youth, but global south people, remembering that climate finance isn't an aid, it's not solidarity funds, it's not help, it's something that the global north owes to the global south because of the historical and ongoing exploitation and injustices that are happening. They have a climate debt to us, and they have to pay for that climate debt. And it's very important that we frame it this way, so it's not something that's optional. It's not something that is something that they will do to save us in the global south as the white saviors. We have to remember that it is reparations and not help and not solidarity. And I think something that was so clear was how, as everyone already mentioned, it was such an exclusive COP where you had the likes of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates walking the same halls, where people who should be impacted should be there. Instead, who are the ones who actually feel welcome? The ones who are causing the climate crisis. We had to endure long queues, all of these things. Sometimes you'd not be allowed in negotiations. They're using COVID as a way to keep people in civil society out, yet the fossil fuel leaders, the VIPs who are causing the climate crisis, are so welcome to just walk in and even have this security team with them to let them through so that they're protected. Protected from who? From climate activists. And you can really see that there was so much police brutality during the strikes also with fellow youth climate activists, and they tried to portray this difference or separation from the inside youth climate activists and the outside youth climate activists, but we're all the same. But they tried to make it so that the ones who were outside were bad youth climate activists, but we were all coming together demanding for the same thing. And it's just their way to separate the movement more, to separate people more. And I'm really starting to grow more and more out of this idea that it should be a youth-led movement, because it really shouldn't just be youth-led. It is something that should be led by the most marginalized sectors of society, something that should be led by the multi-sectoral, intergenerational movement that we need to achieve climate justice. And their focus, a lot of like this morning, COP26 posted a video about youth empowerment, and that youth are an unstoppable force, and that we're listening to the youth. But if they were really listening to the youth, there would be action. We're still seeing that in terms of policies, we're still going above 2 degrees Celsius limit. They're saying that 1.5 has been kept alive, but it's not being put into policy. And that's what we have to make sure, that all these far off targets, they need to have short-term measurable ways so that we can see if we're actually reaching these targets, not just seeing, oh, it's 2045, oops, we're not going to reach our 2050 target, adjust at naman. Because that's what they did with the climate finance pledge that they did in 2009. In 2021, they should have been already giving 100 billion US dollars per year, but they said in 2020, oh, oops, let's do 2023 instead. So we have to really make sure that we have these measurable ways, and we have to also make sure that we get rid of creative accounting. So what that means is that a lot of the emissions being counted by the global north is just based on what they want to count. So there are things that they're not counting at all, but their emissions are going down. And so there is just so much lying and bullshit that's happening just to maintain that profit, just to maintain that this system that really is so obsessed with the fossil fuel industry. And aside from that, again, I cannot stress enough the need for reparations, and to always remember that, you know, that's how shitty the inside was, but the people outside, the movements, the people coming together every single day, there were actions outside the UN Climate Summit. And that's where true leadership was. That's where you saw people coming together, people collaborating, people working together in unity for the same thing. And if people can do it, so-called leaders should be able to do it too. They should be able to collaborate, listen to each other, learn from each other, and hold each other accountable. But they're not doing that. So we're going to keep doing it day after day, because the fight doesn't stop at COP26. It doesn't stop at COP27. It stops only when we achieve climate justice.
Thank you, Mitzi. I love it so much. There were so many words that we should look up, read more about, and discover the context. We have betrayal, greenwashing, delaying, exploitation, injustices, reparation, lying, and bullshit. Thank you so much for your frankness and honesty. And in the interest of time, if there are any questions that our panelists, our attendees have for our panelists, you can feel free to ask that. We are asking one last question with one last line of answer from our youth panelists. We want to know, and when I say one line, I mean one line, okay? One line, no explanations, just one phrase, one line, 10 words. What is your hope for the next COP? No explanations, just one line. I'm going to give you 3 seconds to think about your hope for the next COP. One short line. 3, 2, 1. We start with Mitzi.
I do not have hopes. I have expectations and demands for climate justice.
I love it. Jeff.
In the next COP, climate justice will win.
Marinelle? Unmute mo na, Marinette. Marinelle, unmute mo na.
Sorry. I do not hope also, but I do demand for compensation for loss and damage and climate justice.
Young people are
Ang
here.
hirap pang Miss Universe yung peg ng question.
Oh,
Online.
para panghuli, no? No, but young people are here. They know what they're talking about. They know what they want to demand for. And young leaders not only need to listen to us young people, they need to pay attention, consider our voices in the decisions that they make. And it's very clear from Marinel, from Jeff, from Mitzi, that we demand climate action. We need to see it right now more than ever, especially that the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. Maraming salamat, and I turn you over back to our host and moderator. It was great speaking with you, Mitzi, Jeff, and Marina.
Right. And I hope everyone can hear me now. Okay, thanks, Val, and to our panelists, Jefferson Estela, Marinel Ubaldo, and Mitzi Tan for that very insightful discussion. Damang-dama ko yung disappointment ng ating mga kabataan sa naganap na COP26. Ngunit damang-dama ko rin yung pag-asa na dala ng ating kabataan na hindi sila titigil hanggat hindi natin makakamtan ang climate justice. So again, to those who are joining us, welcome to our forum entitled Turning Ambition into Reality, Climate Action in the Philippines after COP26 and Beyond. And again, we are live on the following FB pages: Aksyon Klima, Living Laudato Si, Archdiocese of Manila, Greenpeace Philippines, Okonomedia, LCOY at Youth for Strike Climate. And I also enjoin everyone to please share this forum to your Facebook pages. And this part of the forum po, again, we will be having another moderated panel discussion on how the Philippine non-government stakeholders can be meaningfully involved in climate action. This panel will be moderated by a development worker focusing on climate and disaster resilience with civil society organizations, communities, local governments, and other stakeholders. And she is currently teaching at the Institute of Fisheries Policy and Development Studies, College of Fisheries in the University of the Philippines in the Visayas. Mga kasama, Ms. Jessica Dator Bercilia.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And thank you for inviting us to this session. And as was originally stated, we will have a session on how Philippine NGOs can be meaningfully involved in climate action. And as was also stated earlier, we've already heard a lot of analysis on the COP, no? And in the interest of time, we'll be narrowing the questions that we have from 4 to 2. And we will have four sets of four panelists for this session, and we will have a representative from the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, Ms. Denise Fontanilla, and we have with us from the Center for Environment Concerns, Ms. Leah May Torres, and from the Waves for Water, Ms. Jenica Dizon. And they will also be joined by a representative from the indigenous peoples, the indigenous Kadaklan from Paracelis Mountain Province, Philippines, and the communications officer of Debdeba. We have Ms. Helen Magata. The presentation of Father Angelito Cortez will be shared with all of you towards the end of our session, and I do hope, can you please spotlight our give a spotlight on our resource persons for now. Of course, we would want to hear from each of our resource persons, in a sentence. If there's a word that captures, for example, how they would view, the outcomes of COP26, what would it be? And if they were to charge towards the future, hearing from all the outcomes that were presented, what should be the priority action from your sector? I think, we've had enough, of the sharing of the sentiments, but we also want to hear from you, what is your main takeaway, from COP26, and how would you, from your own specific sector, move forward? If there was a priority area of action, what will it be? Okay, can we hear first from Helen?
Good morning. Thank you, Ms. Jessica. I don't know how much time I have for this.
just a minute or two, so we can move on to the next question, please.
Sure. Thank you. So I am Helen Magata, and I'm a part of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. So there's large delegation of indigenous peoples who usually attend the conference of parties. And Tibtaba has been part of this for some time now. But for COP26, there are some points that I wish to share to sort of, well, celebrate, but also share in terms of how we can better support non-government organizations' engagement in COPs going forward. So we had, the UK presidency had lots of activities prior to COP, and some of them were targeted with dialogues with indigenous peoples around nature-based solutions and IP leadership of indigenous peoples leadership. This resulted in some good things in COP, which, for example, include the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. I think it's one of the most active pavilion. We had 72 events in the entire 2 weeks, and also had dialogues with the presidency itself. So our priorities in the COP26 include the first annual Indigenous Knowledge Holders Gathering. That's a historic gathering with representation from 7 sociocultural regions as part of the facilitative working group on the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So this platform was created back in Paris to create a platform of exchange among traditional knowledge holders, and also to strengthen indigenous peoples and local communities engagement at all policy levels. In terms of climate finance, we have 2 points. So there's a standing pledge for 100 billion USD per year, and that has not been realized nor delivered by the developed countries. And we were dismayed, to say the least, and shocked, concerning to hear the developed countries even discussing whose responsibility it is to deliver this climate finance. Second, there's also been a pledge for forests and indigenous peoples in COP26 that was announced of 1.7 billion US dollars. However, the reality we have is now we don't have an official figure of how much really climate finance indigenous peoples are receiving. And this is really missing in all the national and other reports in terms of climate finance. So we'd like to see that 1.7 USD pledge that is really going to be accessed by and managed by indigenous peoples. Another thing that I want to highlight maybe is the Article 6. So we welcome, of course, the inclusion of the rights of indigenous peoples in some provisions of the Article 6 negotiations, but we are looking forward to having a really independent grievance mechanism or process in Article 6.8. So we think this, and also we think that some provisions in the consultation processes in 6.4 are inadequate. So yeah, there are two more things. We want to share that the indigenous peoples, women and gender have been included seats in the advisory board of the CTCN board, which is welcome. But also in terms of moving forward, we want to see that more supported at the national level, and also how support at the national level in terms of securing tenure and rights of indigenous peoples around land territories and natural ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. So in a gist, it's really all about inclusion in decision-making process, inclusion in financing, and well-defined stake, in the decisions of implementation that are being pushed forward in Article 6. So thank you very much for that, Helen. We'll go back to you in a little while, but let's hear from Denise for now. Denise? Can you respond to the same question? You're on mute, Denise. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So, well, COPs are rarely magnificent, and Glasgow was no different and was, I dare say, more challenging than most. Was it all enough? No, rarely is, but I believe in my organization, ICSC believes that we reached many of our objectives, looking at things from a long view and fighting the long fight. So I was the sole representative of ICSC to COP26. Among other things, I supported the work of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, or CVF, as ICSC is a member of its experts advisory group. So now from 48 CVF member countries, including the Philippines, with a total of 1.2 billion in population, COP26 found the forum expanding to a total of 55 countries and 1.4 billion citizens. And 1,000 people and organizations, including Aksyon Klima, Christian Aid, the Filipino Domestic Workers Association, Fridays for Future, Greenpeace, and WWF signed up to the CVF Glasgow Emergency Pact to ensure COP26 is a success and delivers climate justice. We are not completely satisfied, of course, but we believe we can work with the outcomes of COP26 because we have been laying down the work, and as we can see from, you have heard from all the panelists here, the work continues among us civil society groups, even in the private sector, even among some national and subnational governments. And we believe that civil society organizations such as us, many of us here, have definitely an important role to play in making governments accountable, including the Philippines. And we certainly believe that the Philippine government needs to come more prepared next time it attends a COP of this magnitude. And we believe Congress needs to demand answers to why we were offered more contradictions within the ruling administration, particularly between the finance and energy departments, and with respect to the support needed to advance the global goal.
Okay, thank you very much, Denise. I'll still come back to you because we have a second round of points that we would want you to respond to. Leah from CAC, can we hear from you, please?
Hi. Maybe I won't be repeating the other points mentioned before, but basically it's the same sentiment of being not really not satisfied, or more accurately disappointed with COP. So we know that the COP is not like the final solution to our climate crisis, but it really highlighted what's happening on the ground. For example, for our experience, we really saw the lack of inclusivity. The most ironic experience that I had was standing outside the consultation of the COP president with NGOs, as an NGO not being able to attend that consultation since they already reached the limit of organizations attending. So as I was standing outside watching it from my phone and not really being able to share interventions, we saw organizations saying how difficult it was for them to attend, and many of their communities who want to go there are not able to attend. So it's basically institutions, NGOs that are able to attend, but the people who are actually experiencing the worst effects of climate change are not there. So it begs the question of how do we see how accurate is the presentation of the real events happening on the ground, and how appropriate are the measures that are stated in the documents, no? So we see that it is actually the governments and the corporations that are taking the spotlight. We hear about their promises and their own versions of reality. But since we have also participated in the Blue Zone in the green zone and the civil society side events, you can actually see the difference of what the people are saying, the people who are actually affected, the governments, the corporations, and what are their solutions to the climate crisis. So with this, we can see that you should not just believe everything that we hear, but you should really be more informed of what is happening so that we can also forward more better alternatives. And just to also agree with the previous speakers, the targets are not ambitious enough. It does not meet our time frame of achieving this 1.5 degree Celsius target of limit to warming. And what was really highlighted was the lack of the promise of climate justice, but actions speak louder than words. And we can see that from how governments and performed in the negotiations, you can see that they have not really stick to their promise of climate justice. So there are many events that also talked about loss and damage, and you can see that they were not satisfied with the commitments made by their governments, and as Mitzi said, the reparations are not there, and it was also, the COP was also during the time of the Yolanda anniversary, and that in itself was a highlight of the lack of action with the experience of local communities. And the focus on human rights was really lacking. Just recently, the UN Human Rights Council formally recognized the access to a healthy environment as a fundamental right. But what we saw there was a lack of focus on how to really uphold that right. And also, what we were really disappointed was there was no mention at all of the killings of environmental defenders, even if in many events it was mentioned, especially by the indigenous people. So I attended the COP president consultation of indigenous people with the COP president, and the indigenous people groups were saying how many of their community members were killed because of their action to address the climate crisis, but the COP president did not respond to that at all. So if you want to address the climate crisis, we should help the people who are doing something about it, who are filling the gaps of inaction of the government. So I think that kind of conversation should always be included when we talk about climate justice.
Thank you, Leah. No, I just want to put bring together what Denise actually pointed out, and you're pointing out. You talk about the gaps, that vision of you standing outside the halls of consultation and not being there, and yet Denise was actually saying about how they were able to participate into very important platforms of influence, for example, whether or dialogue like CVF and all, because CVF actually is working with governments and already with the negotiators, and this is very telling from what we already saw. If we want inclusion in the processes, the work actually starts long before the COP. I think that's an important lesson for us. No, the work starts long before the COP, and the engagement with negotiators starts long before the COP itself. So that we are ensured representation. And true enough, Leah, not all of us will be accepted in those calls. So the challenge for us here is how to be able to network amongst ourselves so that we can be represented. So that for every single NGO that is represented there, he or she, that civil society organization carries the calls of other civil society organizations, because numbers will really be crucial in this context. No, so thank you very much for your points, both Leah and Denise. And Jenica, would you want to add on to that discussion, please?
Yes, very much. Thank you. With regard to the sector I represent, which is water, so it's really not in the forefront of a lot of conversation, but really water is the medium by which we feel climate change the most. Either we have an abundance of it, a lack of it, and so droughts mean less water is available, which leads to wars, conflict, displacement. In the Philippines, we experience lots of flooding, which leads to water contamination, and then glacial melting, which involves, sea level rise means increased saltwater intrusion to our water, groundwater resources that are already vulnerable. And water is really central. It's vital to our life, to our survival, and this is really what we try to advocate for and further as a water sanitation and hygiene nonprofit. And so while I echo the same sentiments and the same frustrations, I do recognize some wins, at least in the water sector with COP26. And I guess this hasn't really been highlighted a lot because, water really isn't in everybody's purview. But, the wins really involve, for example, the first, like the IP pavilion, the first water pavilion also was set up. There was also the launch of a multi-sectoral water and climate coalition. There was also a launch of the Glasgow Fair Water Footprint Declaration, which calls for more equitable and just use of water resources. So with regard to water, there's a lot of things that I can talk about that really focus and help put that forward in the conversation of climate change. Because while it is the medium by which we feel it the most, there's also a lot of innovation and really it's still central in the nature-based solutions that COP26 is also in some ways really highlighted more as a way to combat climate change. So I would like to highlight that because I think that hasn't really been talked a lot as much. And really that is really the goal of us in civil society. We represent quite niche sometimes sectors, but really our goal is to highlight the role of how climate change is a multi-sectoral issue. I think Ms. Jessica also highlighted that the role for us to really collaborate more. And while we focus on certain causes, certain issues, we need to collaborate more and really acknowledge that climate change is multi-sectoral is really the gap that us CSOs and nonprofits really need to continue to bridge because, duty bearers, government, well, they take a lot of time to work. COP26, you get why it's so frustrating and it's long and it's set up for turtle pace success because it's 200 countries almost trying to put forward their own needs, desires, wants, and then so the role of us really as civil society nonprofits is really to highlight this multi-sectoral issue and the need really to collaborate more because that's just we really don't have the luxury of time. So those are just a few points I wanted to highlight in the interest of time, and I echo the same sentiments of frustration, but also do recognize some wins in terms of the water sanitation and hygiene sector.
Thank you very much. For those who know me, I really like to end the session, not with a air of pessimism, but something for us to look forward to together. So moving ahead, and there are many young people here listening to us, and you're already experts in the field. How do you think civil society organization can better engage the government so that our key positions are upheld and owned by our own negotiators? And how can we better, that's locally, nationally, and how do you think can we better engage in the next COP, in the future, given that we are in this new normal context with a lot of challenges? So two, how do we better engage our negotiators and the government? And then how can we better engage in COPs in the future? So two questions. Can I have Leah start off the conversation, please?
Okay, for the first question, I think engaging with governments, communication is a two-way system. It's not really just us CSOs trying to reach out, but maybe also a message that I hope this webinar would be able to get across is that governments should also be proactive in reaching out. So since they are the duty bearers, I hope they also provide us with that space. Because for us, we can write letters or ask for discussions, but not all of the time these invitations would be really met. So I hope that since we're starting this conversation, and we know we're working towards the same goal, that this COP would show us that we can have venues to raise these discussions and really have a way to work together. And I hope it is not just us NGOs, but also local communities, those at the grassroots that will be able to engage. Because I think we can also facilitate that conversation But I hope also like local government units, the DNR, the Climate Change Commission can also will also be conscious of that. And as for what we can do, I think it's important to be informed. So even for us, we don't really know the ins and outs of this whole COP process. So really knowing the opportunities, what we can actually get from this is really important. And second, knowing the situation on the ground, we should really be grounded with the experience of those who are most affected. So that's the farmers, the fisher folk, the indigenous people who are at the front lines, and supporting them in their campaigns. And I think that we should also recognize that the COP is not an end goal. And as mentioned, we have opportunities here, but we also have other things that we should do. And this should be just one part of a whole environmental movement or our whole work in this advocacy. So we have work in negotiations at the international level. We can also maximize this, as mentioned by our previous speakers, with the CHR, with the DNR. But we should also continue with our advocacy, community organizing, education work, solidarity work, and mobilization. I think that's where CSOs really excel, and that's what we should maximize. So I think it's still an idea that this is a movement building and not just a participation in one conference.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah. I will withhold first the synthesis until all the resource persons have spoken. Helen, would you like to give your thoughts on the questions raised?
Thank you. And Leah has provided a very, very good platform to start with. And I agree with everything that she has said already. But I think in terms of how to do it in practical terms, I can offer some points. So we know that the Action Klima, for example, does preparatory meetings, and this is where we come together as CSOs and NGOs to learn about the context of the COP and what are our priority concerns. In the same way, the Indigenous Peoples, International Indigenous Peoples Caucus also do a lot of in-between COP meetings, and prior to the COP, we also do a lot of preparatory meetings for us to identify which are our priorities and who's going to do and follow agenda items and such. I think, and I agree with what Leah has said, that in the same way, we should also have some national prep meetings, which is ideally convened by the national government, where CSOs and maybe ensuring that all constituencies in the UNFCCC are represented, so that we have a collective learning session and also collective drafting of our positions, so that when we go to COP, we are singing the same song, or at least supporting positions of our country, and our countries supporting our position in the same manner. Maybe we can also think about how to share events that we can support, because while COP negotiations are important, I think the COP also provides a lot of opportunities where we can do a lot of alliance building and networking, side events, information and education, and exchange of knowledge. Or maybe I think maybe as a medium or long-term action is for an establishment of a mechanism, really a national mechanism of how NGOs and CSOs and non-government stakeholders can submit inputs and positions to influence or at least inform national positions of our government. For this COP, there was, at least from the Indigenous Peoples constituency, we saw increased number of Indigenous Peoples youth, but I think there should also be a more intentional and more focused, initiative in terms of really engaging them, not just in actions outside or in the green zone, but also in in terms of meaningful engagements within the negotiations, and also in developing our national and common positions. So yeah, I think those are the points that I can think of, and I'll be happy to provide other examples of how, for example, NGOs are working with their governments and other actors in terms of in other platforms. So, for example,
thank you, Helen. Can I cut you short in the interest of time? So we will definitely, perhaps the host, can open these platforms for engagement where you can continue to share your ideas. So I'm sorry to have to cut you there, Helen, but those are very, very valuable inputs. And may I ask Jenica to go first, and then Denise, you give the final word. Okay, Jenica, please.
Yes, thank you. So really, we understand that COP really sets itself up in some ways for failure, because it's rooted in colonialism, capitalism, and really with a general disconnect to the realities of people in the front lines of climate change. So really, this is where CSOs and NGOs can come in and help bridge that disconnect. As Leah and Helen mentioned, engagement really is two-way. So I think we have some or one, Sir Albert, from government here. So really, that's quite indicative already of how there's a lot of opportunity to build better communication, engagement, and involvement. Really making each step consultative, not just during COP, because I think a lot of NGOs and civil society, they really had a hard time being able to speak with government. It's really Philippine delegation that was not really keen on sitting down with us. So really that was really a frustration on our end from the Philippines civil society attendees. And so I think just learning from that, really making each step of the way more consultative, more collaborative, and really with engagement from multiple sectors, because really at the end of the day, the goal is to realize that we're all on the same side. There's really no need to be divisive, to keep each other in the dark, because climate change is an existential threat. And so whatever plans there are, it's really plans to save us and humanity. So I echo the same sentiments, and really just look forward to the whole process as leading up to the next COP being more consultative.
Thank you very much, Jenica. Denise?
So thanks, Jessica and everyone in the panel. We believe that civil society groups must together call for a reboot in how the government has been addressing the climate emergency, especially given the upcoming elections and the change in administration. And with it, maybe many of our climate negotiators. The approach has been about more of bean counting greenhouse gases, rather than upgrading everything, modernizing, and ensuring that climate action speaks to working families. Our policymakers and economic managers, current and future, must prioritize resilience and policy coherence in development policy. We CSOs must campaign on several fronts and levels of governance to firmly establish that coal is behind expensive power bills and is intermittent and unreliable, unlike renewable energy. We must improve air quality, as the status quo is costing us 4.5 trillion pesos annually, or 23% of our GDP. We must move people, not cars. We must protect our blue carbon ecosystems. All of these will lead us faster to decarbonization outcomes as a co-benefit, and not necessarily the main aim, which is resilience and long-term development.
Thank you very much for what you've all shared. Can we please give our resource persons a big round of applause? I don't know if there's a button there, but I'll do that for everyone. But just before we end this session, after this session, we will hear from the thoughts of our other resource person, Father Angelito Cortez, was giving us his thought on the video. But for this particular session, there were very important points that were raised by our resource persons. I could not share screen, but the thoughts there were: number one, we should stay rooted. When we're advocating, we should be able to value, as they shared, the power of representation, but be keen on not over-representing sectors that will already be able to represent themselves. Now, like for example, the indigenous peoples, if the most vulnerable can speak up for themselves, so much the better. Your resource persons also highlighted the importance of making sure that we strategize. We learn to strategize. We learn to prioritize. We learn to push for collective reflection and positions. We also work towards consultative processes, and continue to claim those spaces of participation in decision making for civil society organizations. But more importantly, when we make these calls, we also have to study where exactly are those windows of intervention as provided by our policies, laws, and different mandates. Finally, our resource person says, our final resource person said, we need to be able to think, in more transformative processes. We cannot do this advocacy business as usual. Seeing, for example, our discontent, in the recent COP, we need to be able to reboot so that if we want transformative processes in governance and transformative processes in decision making, we also have to have transformative approaches in our advocacy. Now, and with that, I'll turn you now over to our host, who will share with you the video of Father Angelito Cortez from the Franciscan International. And while doing so, we are also being asked to already turn on our videos. Thank you so much. Sheena, Rodney, I now turn over to you the facilitation of this forum.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Jessica, and to our panel members, Ms. Denise Fontanilla, Ms. Leah Mai Torres, Ms. Jessica Dison, for that very rich discussion that we had earlier. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to open the floor now for questions. These questions came from our audience, from our Facebook pages, and also from our friends here on Zoom. So let us start the question. We have a question here from Mr. Melvin Porzuelo. The question is the cost of the ADB plan to decommission the 10 PH coal-fired power plants a sovereign loan? And would this become stranded assets shouldered by the people? Again, the question is the cost of the ADB plan to decommission the 10 Philippine coal-fired power plants a sovereign loan? And this would become stranded assets shouldered by the people. So any of our panelists would like to answer that first? We have Sir Jerry, go ahead.
Thank you for that question, Melvin.
Sir Jerry?
Energy. Sorry?
Go ahead. I think your internet's a little bit wonky po. Go ahead.
Ahead. Sorry. Am I clear now?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So one of the highlight then ng COP26, which I wasn't able to touch because of very limited time, sobrang dami ng pwedeng itouch sa COP. But one of the highlight is the launching of the ADB Energy Transition Mechanism, which is basically a buyout mechanism of coal plants in Asia mainly, and consequently another facility which is called the Climate Investment Fund, which is an MDB multilateral development bank financing mechanism, which is housed in the World Bank, launched its similar buyout mechanism. And in both are kasama ang Pilipinas as pilot countries. And many write-ups na nag-circulate dyan. Doon sa specific na tanong ni Melvin, And this is the very reason, Melvin, that's why CSOs in Asia actually engage the Asian Development Bank and sent a statement and a letter that we were asking the bank not to launch the mechanism yet because there's a lot of questions surrounding the proposal. And I can, kumbaga parang isang buong webinar ang ilalaan natin dyan just for us to be able to actually navigate through it. And one of that is precisely your question. Ibig sabihin walang permi dito, Melvin. Ang pinaka meron is that one, public funds will be used mainly right now by developed countries. Ang question dyan, ano ang take ng mga citizens doon? Because this will basically be used to buy out yung corporations in order for those coal plants to be phased out or nang mas mabilis. So ang daming questions agad dyan tulad ng tanong mo. And some of this, a key question is that when we laid out sino-sino at ano-anong mga coal plants dito sa Pilipinas, sino ang nasa likod ng pagtatayo ng mga coal plants na yon, at sino yung mga banks that are interested and investors that are interested in this mechanism, these are the same corporations. So, na-imagine ba natin yon? Same corporation that has profited in the expansion of, sabi nga ni Denise, costly electricity from coal plants are the same corporation that will benefit from this buyout mechanism. So, bahagi yan ng kailangan nating i-traverse. And that's why the position, and we've been asking the ADB, na dahan-dahan tayo. And we're calling for transparency and engagement, a full engagement bago natin i-roll out ang kung ano-anong mekanismo. In fact, the ADB hasn't done a full feasibility study on this. Okay? So, kailangan nating, kumbaga natin maganda yon, Melvin, na nire-raise natin yung mga issues na to. And ang last point ko kasi dito, is this the best mechanism to hasten the transition in the Philippines? Yun yung pinakatanong doon eh. But what is now kumbaga occurring ay merong dagdag na mekanismo, dagdag na impetus for us to hasten that process ng transition natin papuntang renewable energy. But there's a lot of questions that we need to engage on.
Okay, thanks, Sir Jerry. Ms. Denise would like to add to that. Thank you.
All right. Well, just to add to what Jerry said, we believe the Asian Development Bank doesn't really gain any points with announcing cash that might ironically end up prolonging the life of already stranding coal. If the ADB has cash for retirement, and if the intent is truly to kill coal, and that cash on a limited basis, covering limited time to make just the right amount of storage now and watch coal and fossil gas strand and beg, rather than the case now where garbage assets have suddenly acquired new value. We believe that what the future needs is flexible generation, and that can only be supplied by renewable energy, not coal and not even fossil. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Denise. I would also like to hear Sir Albert Magalang's input on this question. Sir?
Yes, Jermaine. Sorry. A bit cut. Anyway, Jermaine, supposedly dapat ko kasi it should be the Department of Energy ang tinatanong dito na the DNR kasi we're not really engaged in this conversation about coal. Kung EIA or what you call this environmental clearances ang pag-uusapan, then we would like to be engaged. Pero at this point in time, hindi pa. Jermaine, sorry ha? Or...
It's all right, sir. It's all right. So thanks, sir. So to our panel, would it be all right to please keep your cameras turned on, please, so our audience could see us. So we have two more questions from our audiences. We have a question here from Mr. Raul Norbe. During the COP26, our NDC is at 75% greenhouse gas reduction from 2010 to 2030 was reduced to 45% as reported by Mr. Albert Magalang on the mitigation. can someone please clarify this? So to our panel members, if you want to answer the question, could you please raise your hand so we could acknowledge you? But I think this question is there. Sir Albert, go ahead. Please turn on your camera. Thanks so much.
Yes, Jermaine. Actually, I've already provided my response to that question. Actually, napanla na hindi siya nagkaroon ng kanilang misunderstanding. I mean, on the percentage that I have mentioned, it's actually the global target, not the Philippine NDC, the 75%. So the 75% still holds still the target ng Philippine NDC. So the 45% would represent the overall yung target, global target, especially if you have to really work on the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature limit. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay. Anyone who wants to add to that? Okay, let's just move on to the last two more questions. We have a question here from Ms. Milagro Serrana. Was there no prior meeting between the government representatives and NGOs or CSOs or youth regarding climate change issues that need to be addressed before COP26? So anyone who wants to answer that question, please raise your hand so you could be acknowledged. Again, was there no prior meeting between the government representatives and NGOs or CSOs and youth representatives regarding the climate change issues that need to be addressed before COP26? So I can see Sir Albert's hand is raised. Sir Albert, go ahead. You're on mute po, sir.
Okay, so anyway, there was no meeting that were held, especially in preparation for the COP. But before that, may mga small mga webinars and iba't ibang klaseng events wherein napapag-usapan yung ambition, target ng Pilipinas in terms of the NDC, So may mga ganong klaseng discussion, but on the fund itself, yung mismo yung pagpaplano for the COP, wala, hindi yun napag-usapan. Pero yun nga, even ourselves, kaming mga nasa government, was surprised din kasi hindi lang short notice, kasi parang wala nang time masyado to organize ourselves, even the candidate, the delegates. Last minute yun, pag-organize ng Philippine delegation to COP. Kaya ourselves mismo ay, while we were on our way to the COP, nagkaroon ng mga self-study, even yung pag-review ng mga documents, we did that na lang while in transit to Glasgow. Kasi yan nga, may mga meetings din, pero hindi ganun ka in-depth yung discussion, but na-identify lang kung ano yung mga agenda items that we will be following, kasi napakaliit ng delegation at hindi lahat ng agenda items ay mapupuntahan. That's why we limited lang. For example, for DNR, nag-focus na lang kami sa Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that yung ibang delegates on finance, and yung iba naman sa loss and damage. So hindi lahat talaga na-cover. Thank you, Jermaine.
Okay, thanks so much. Any additional answer to that question? Ma'am, go ahead. From the Archdiocese of Manila, ma'am. Go ahead po. Please turn on your microphone.
Actually, I would like to congratulate all the NGOs who were there in the COP. You did also your best, though you are not the official delegate for this conference. And I'm also sorry for Albert, who just said that they were not even organized, when they went to COP26. And my question actually goes to for the government, I believe that the government, the Philippine government, having the Climate Change Commission, should have already organized, no, long before the official delegates for this big conference, so that they can come up with some substantial representation for the country. No, and I'm just surprised. I observed also in 2019, in mukhang during this time ng 2016 up to the present, mukhang itong representation ng Philippines sa COP ay parang hindi prepared masyado and not even properly represented also in the case of the different issues and concerns that you are supposed to be present, no, sa mga during the COP. And then at the end of the day, parang this COP also is not really serving its purpose, as I feel the disappointments and frustrations of the young people that were present in the COP. And I do not see if there's really big hope pa for COP27 and onwards. So parang nagbibilang na lang ng COP, and then at the end of the day, panay frustrations ang resulta. So then the last question, that was comment and question ito, no? So the last question I would like to pose is this: after all this, what should be the way forward, no, for CSOs and for the government? Ano ba talaga? Kasi mukhang as I see it until now, climate change is not yet a priority, despite the fact na grabe na experiences natin. Hindi siya priority sa government, at more so in our communities who are really struggling to feed themselves. Thank you.
Maybe anyone from our panel members would like to answer that question briefly. For the interest of time, we really have to. We extended the program already.
Jerwin, may I?
After Albert. And, yeah, go ahead. And then after.
Yes. Anyway, just to correct Madam Lu, nice to see you again. Anyway, just to correct ko lang yung sinabi na walang preparation from the Philippine side, Philippine government side. Actually, meron naman, pero in a very short time nakapag-prepare naman kahit paano ang Philippine government. Kaya na-identify yung mga agenda items that will be followed, and then nagkaroon din mga tasking. So short, very short, kaya nga wala nang masyadong hindi na nakapag-consult with the CSOs. Kaya with even the NGOs kailangan dapat meron ding inputs. Pero we've been pa naman tawag dito, very conscious naman yung mga alam naman natin yung mga yung mga what we call dispositions dati ng mga NGO CSOs on climate change, kaya na muna we work on that. We have taken off from those positions na we had in our hands. So yun po ang nangyari. And of course, as a way forward, maraming work programs ang na-identify sa COP26 that government should also act on from this day on to the next COP. So may mga nakalista na mga tasks, work programs na kailangan gawin ng mga governments. Thank you po.
All right. So maybe a brief answer from our panel members. Let's start with Jeff.
Hello po. To answer po yung question from Ma'am Lu, from a young people perspective, siguro one of the ways forward that we can do is to have a stronger and more united contingent in the next COP, because as young people who is first timer, I haven't really saw the unitedness from the CSOs, especially from the Philippine government. So I think that should be one of our ways forward to really show that we are united, and to make it more inclusive, at para po makita talaga ng mga, especially for those who wants to be also in COP in the next COPs, na meron silang titignang models for the next negotiations.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Sir Jerry.
Thank you dun sa tanong ni Lou. And very important question kasi yun naman talaga yung question ng webinar na to. And marami dun sa binanggit kanina maraming kung babaybayin natin yung mga season mas nauna sa akin na dumadalo ng COP at talagang nag-negotiate. Nandiyan si Gian, nandiyan si Yeb. Only started like 2000, first ko 2007. So medyo mas bata ako sa mga yan pagdating sa COP. Pero ang simple lang yung sinabi nila mabagal talaga ang COP because ang daming compromises dyan. And that has been since the beginning. Okay? So, and lalo na nung nasandal yung mga developed countries that they are the culprits. And how to exact responsibility and obligation, mahirap talaga yon. Pag binaybay natin, pag sinamarize, and it can be a separate webinar by, of course, our esteemed colleagues who have been in the negotiation. Wala pa rito si Din Tony, and of course, Red. Tagal-tagal na nila dyan. That has been the fixture. But what is important is, meron ba tayong nakuha doon that we can use to actually push through domestically and even our engagement internationally? Yun kasi yung key question. And taking off from Paris, alam natin na ganun ang context. Alam natin na punong-puno ng fossil fuel ang mundo. Alam natin na ang developed country nagpupondo pa rin, so on and so forth. In Paris, the key battle is to include 1.5 degrees. Kasi we can use that, we can kumbaga, mapapanghawakan natin siya to pursue meaningful changes in policies, in the energy transition sa Pilipinas, and internationally. So, dito, ano yung outcome na pwede nating mapanghawakan? Ako, I would say, having been involved in the last 10 years or 15 years or so in the energy transition, ang laki. Why? Sabi nga ni Yep, for the first time, historic, fossil fuel was included in the text. Ibig sabihin, malaki ang compromise na ginawa ng mga developed countries, even the corporations, undeniable na. Umabot na tayo sa punto na yun. Pero yung work around it is not in the COP. The COP is just a moment ng accumulated work nating lahat. And pag binaybay natin dito, bakit ang Pilipinas may coal moratorium pero hindi nakapirma doon sa coal phase out on number 3? Because they're not sure. And we need to force them, right? This is the process. Bakit ko sinasabi ito? 1 year ago, we have a coal moratorium. Up to this year, walang listahan kung alin ang tanggal na coal plants. We need to force them. From 16 gigawatt, they are down to 8 gigawatt. Why? They don't want it. We are forcing them. That's the work. Yun yung papel natin, mga civil society, yun ang papel ng mga communities in engaging this process and using this process to our advantage in terms of moving the actual change that is needed to save all of us, to actually achieve still approximate 1.5 degree goal. So, ano ang next? Ang next is, sabi ko nga kanina, the first fire has been shot by the Philippine civil society movement on a resolution calling for an investigation sa House of Representatives. A Senate version will be filed compelling the Philippine government to raise the renewable energy ambition from 35%, which is reflected in the PEP and the NDC, to 50% because of the climate emergency and the rising cost of coal, oil, and gas in the global market. Yun yung pwede kong panghawakan, and moving forward, how do we, maraming binanggit, sobrang dami. So it has to be grounded, sabi nga natin. It has to be, we need to make use of the outcomes in order for us to move forward in deeper way and meaningful way. Paano natin pipigilan yung 24 gigawatts na plano ng gas plants? Paano natin pipigilan yung natitirang 8 gigawatts ng coal plants? Paano natin i-raise ang vision ng renewable energy, finance, so on and so forth. So I think that is the kumbaga parang makukuha natin sa COP na to, and how is it useful for us moving forward.
All right, thank you, Sir Jerry. We have an answer here from Mr. Yeb Sanyo, and he said, in the interest of time, I'll just type in my answer. Way forward, we continue with the work of building the movement nationally and globally, building solidarity like we have never done before, set aside our differences, and not to be each other's enemy, and exert pressure at the national level. Our role as Philippine CSOs is to push the Philippine government to represent the interests of Filipinos, both present and future. This also means radically pushing for transformation within the Philippines and beyond. And additional, our destination is not Glasgow or Paris or any nice city. Our destination should be the hearts and minds of the Filipino people. Even in our country, a lot of Filipinos need to understand this issue more. And yes, yun nga po, yun po ang kasagutan po ni Mr. Yeb Sanyo. All right, so for the interest of time, as much as we would like to accommodate more questions, we really have to end this forum. And thank you so much for joining us. And before we formally close this forum, I would like to introduce someone who would introduce to the speaker who would formally close our forum. I'd like to call on the convener of Aksyon Klima and Executive Director of Living Laudato Si, Mr. Rodney Galicia. Hi, Kuya Rodney.
Ay, magandang araw po sa lahat. And nagpapasalamat po ako sa lahat ng mga dumalo. Of course, in behalf of the Aksyon Klima Steering Committee na nandito rin kasama natin. Hindi lamang po dito magtatapos ang ating pag-uusap dahil marami pa pong mga sesyon ng ating gagawin, lalong-lalo na dahil una-una magtatapos ang mga termino ng ating mga commissioners at pangalawa din ay magkakaroon ng eleksyon at mapapalit yung mga iba't ibang mga ahensya ng gobyerno, kanilang mga pinuno. Nevertheless, as Aksyon Klima's statement would say, we will release very, very soon, we state with hope our interest to meaningfully engage with the Philippine government in carrying the momentum from COP26 and translating it to effective climate change adaptation and mitigation programs at the national and local levels. But overall, kinikilala natin ang mga landmark commitments na naandyan sa COP26, especially when compared to recent climate negotiations. But until these words are turned into urgent, just, inclusive, and effective solutions, we have earned the right to be wary of these new promises. We have seen it at the global and national levels. And the longer we delay meaningful climate action and the more time and resources we invest in false solutions, the more suffering vulnerable communities will continue to endure from climate change impacts. But ultimately, it will also cost our economy tremendous losses and damages that could only affect our pursuit of development. Not only our economy, but our lives and livelihoods. Whether inside the conference hall or on the streets with thousands of others, we remain steadfast in our calls and we want climate justice. We demand finance for loss and damage. We call for global and local solidarity. We demand higher ambition, turn into concrete climate action, and we need them now. And we hope that we will continue this dialogue, but not only dialogue, but more on action. As Yeb would always say, dapat nasa puso natin, sa bawat Pilipino, idadaan natin ito at pagkikilusan. So again, thank you very much sa ating mga panelists at sa mga speakers. And we'll provide you with the copies of the presentations and even the videos. You can replay it via YouTube and via Facebook. And yes, and thank you, Maine. Magpa-flight ka pa. And to close, is our closing video. Let's watch and listen to Father Angel Cortez. But before Father Angel Cortez, let's I think meron na palang meron ng photo op. Di tayo makapag-photo op dahil webinar type ito. But yeah, let's listen to Father Angel. And again, thank you very much.
Good morning. Greetings of peace and all good to everybody. I'm very happy to be here, to be with the panel in discussing about the post-COP assessment. I'm also happy to journey
Okay, I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Let's try that again. Okay.
COP26 in Glasgow. I'm very happy to be here, to be with the panel in discussing about the post-COP assessment. I'm also happy to journey with young people and climate activists coming from the Philippines during the COP26 in Glasgow. Well, if you're going to ask me what are my assessments in terms of addressing the climate crisis vis-a-vis COP26, well, unfortunately, I am not really happy with the outcome. They missed the opportunity to really hit the target and talking about loss and damage, which is a very important issue to discuss, with knowing that there are a lot of representatives coming from the global south, especially the vulnerable countries, including ours. They also missed to talk about the divestment, which is a very important issue, which also the church is supporting. Even the Pope himself are calling for the divestment, but it seems until now there are a lot of countries that are not really into the divestment, and they want to push their political and capitalist agenda. So yeah, but I'm happy with the journey, especially with civil society organizations, with the young people that I am with, representing the voice of the people, especially who are not there present. Yeah. Based on the outcome of COP26, are you hopeful? Why or why not? Well, I am hopeful in a sense that there are countries that are giving us inspiration, like Scotland as the host country. Not UK in general, but Scotland, giving an example of giving £2 billion for loss and damage. And for me, this is a hope that there are countries that really believes that there are huge impact of climate change. And I know it's not yet over, and we will continue the discussion in Egypt. But I am really hopeful, as long as there are many young people that are talking about it. People are not talking about climate change. Even the church are talking about climate change. So there's a hope. The only thing is, how are we going to put action into that hope? That's another question. How important the role of the CSOs in the negotiation, such as the Paris Conference? Well, we all know that we will not have victory during COP in Paris without the contribution of the civil society. And I myself witnessed how the Filipino CSOs worked a lot to really keep the fire burning, to keep that call for 1.5 alive. I was part of the organization for the first climate march in the Philippines. I've been a supporter of the network for quite some time, and I witnessed the journey. And I think the CSO is really playing a big role, not only to give technical support or advice, but to really bring the voices of the people, their partners in the Philippines, and also, to keep that call moving. Because sometimes when there's no follow-up, then nothing will really happen. In this COP, there are 19 representatives coming from the Philippines as delegates of the government. But the real support is coming from the CSOs, the indigenous peoples, youth, church, and others who are supporting our government in negotiations. But it seems the government lacks support to their own people. What are my calls to the Philippine government, developed countries, and the local community? Well, we all know what had happened to Haiyan. And we lost more than 10,000 people in one night, and still 1,000 are missing. 1 million houses were destroyed, and still we keep convincing ourselves, is climate change really real? But with all the testimonies we've heard, by our witnessing, with all the typhoons that happened, even in the time of pandemic, we know that climate change is really real, and we need to really put all the blah, blah, blah into action. I call the government to really not only fund and support or give time or resources, but to really prioritize climate change as part of the Philippine government agenda, and to have a green agenda in general. I call the global leaders to be really faithful to their promises in Glasgow or in the past COPs, not only as a showcase, but to have a genuine climate reform in their own countries. And I call everybody to really, even a small contribution counts. It doesn't matter if you are knowledgeable with the climate languages, but even a small effort will really count. Pope Francis, in his message in this last COP, said that we need radical decisions, and we need to eliminate, to erase that idea of selfishness. Hindi natin kailangan maging makasarili. In our own field, in our own craft, we can make it happen. And as Filipinos and citizens of this world, we must play the big role. Thank you.
Alright, maraming salamat po sa mensahen pong iyon. And muli maraming salamat po sa ating mga naging panelists ngayong hapon po ito. At syempre sa ating pong mga manonood dito po sa Facebook at the Zoom. At sana po ipagpatuloy pa rin po natin ang laban po para sa kalikasan. At ako po, muli si Jermaine Halandoni de Junya, isang makakalikasang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Bago po tayo pala, tulungan magpaalam yung ating mga panelists dito. I'd like to request everyone in the Zoom room to please open your videos para po sa isang photo op. Hindi po kumpleto ang ating webinar, ating forum kung wala po tayong photo op. Please turn on your cameras. Alright, i-assist po tayo ng ating mga kasama sa Living Laudato.
Right, ready po. 1, 2, 3, smile. Other one. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you.
Alright, thank you po sa ating mga panelists, sa ating mga manonood. Magpatuloy po natin ang ating laban para sa kalikasan.
Salamat po. Salamat, Yeb.
Everyone.
Salamat po.
Maraming salamat sa inyo.
Salamat po.
Thank you, man. Ate May, salamat.
Thank you, Kuya Rodney. See you soon.
Thank you, Tita Lu.